Good morning, my lord.
Good morning, Miss van der Westhuizen. And you have a witness for us?
I do, my lord. Our first witness today is Mr. Graeme McAlister from the Scottish Childminding Association.
Good morning, Mr. McAlister.
Good morning.
Very good. When you're ready, Miss van der Westhuizen.
Thank you, my lord. Mr. McAlister, please can I ask you to give your full names?
My name's Graeme McAlister.
And you've provided a statement to the inquiry.
Yes.
For reference, my lord, that's SCI WT 0323000001. Mr. McAlister, you are the current Chief Executive Officer of the Scottish Childminding Association, or SCMA, is that correct?
That is correct.
And you've held that role since April 2019?
Yes.
In paragraph 6 of your witness statement, you note that the SCMA is the only organisation in Scotland dedicated to all aspects of childminding, and that approximately 82% of childminders in Scotland are members. And then in paragraph 8, you go on to note that the childminding workforce is currently around 3,100 members, and that the SCMA has 2,500 childminder members across all 32 local authorities. That's a far lower number than it was 5 years ago, when there was a workforce of around 4,700, and the SCMA at that point had just under 4,000 members. I'll come on to ask you in a moment about the reasons for that decline, but I'd first like to ask you a little bit more about childminders generally. In terms of the demographics of your membership and the childminding workforce, in paragraph 145 of your statement, you mentioned that during the pandemic, 99.7% of childminders were female. Is that still the case today, or what percentage?
Yes, that's still correct.
And if you could please explain a bit more who tends to become a childminder and what sort of qualifications and training requirements there are for that.
Okay. The main entry point to childminding is predominantly females aged 30 to 39 who have a child or children of their own and have made an informed choice that they want to care for their own children but perhaps have a need to earn an income, a desire to do something more flexibly, perhaps to do something a bit more meaningful and different with their life at that time. So very, very diverse backgrounds. We have childminders who've worked previously as early years practitioners in nurseries, teachers, people from hospitality, banking, police officers, social workers, a very, very diverse range of backgrounds coming into childminding. What unites them is that desire to make a difference for children. What they also bring is a lot of lived experience from their previous careers, having cared for children themselves. And most childminders, when we actually speak to them, find out what they find most rewarding about the profession. It's the impact they make on children. It's seeing children grow and develop in response to their care.
And just in terms of qualifications and training, are there any special requirements in that regard?
There is not a mandated qualification as such to become a childminder. Childminding is a registered form of childcare. That's through the Care Inspectorate, who's a care regulator in Scotland. So childminders undergo a whole range of quality assurance in terms of they undertake self-evaluation, they're regularly inspected, they undertake continuing professional learning. However, if they wish to deliver what's known as funded early learning and childcare, which is a statutory entitlement from the Scottish Government of funded childcare for parents of 3, 4 and eligible 2-year-olds, then to deliver that entitlement they have to obtain an HNC. They have 5 years to do that if they like to, so it can be an HNC or an ICQ3.
Thank you very much. If you could then just explain a little bit about what childminders do and how that differs from other forms of early learning and childcare, please.
Okay, of course. I mean, childminding is a unique form of childcare and family support. Childminders deliver from their home on domestic premises in small numbers. About 82% of childminders are currently registered to care for no more than 6 children at any one time. And there's strict ratios around that, so no more than 1 child under 12 months, no more than 3 children under school age, and no more than 6 in total. But what they do in their setting is very different to other forms of childcare. They have children from birth through to 12, or indeed children with additional support needs, so they can care for children up to 16. So you have this mix of preschool and school-aged childcare, and what's been shown is that there's a range of evidence now to show that by children learning and playing together of different ages, that can actually benefit different aspects of development. So it's a very nurturing form of childcare. There's a high activity, it's very sort of child-led, there's a high activity of play, a high level of outdoors activity, but it's also a very high quality form of childcare. Childminders consistently, annually score higher quality ratings across all quality criteria through independent inspection by the Care Inspectorate than what's called Daycare of Children's Services. So that's local authority and private nurseries combined. But it's also a form of family support in the sense that there's now research to show that parents who use childminders believe they are able to access non-judgmental professional support through a childminder. It helps them with parenting, with skills. Childminders also support children through various transitions, so going to nursery, going to primary school, going to high school. So you've got very strong continuity of care, and it's quite common for childminders to be viewed as an extended part of the family. So children who have been cared for as a childminder, once they become adults, will regularly invite childminders to their weddings, to 21st celebrations. So does that give you a sense?
It does very much, thank you. In terms of business models, what business models do childminders have? I think you mentioned 82% are sole practitioners or sole traders. What about the others?
The other 12%, I mean, childminders can operate with what's known as an assistant. They still have to maintain those ratios I was telling about for caring for children, but as long as they can maintain that through assistance, they can extend the size that they're setting. Some childminders work in partnership together, where one registered childminder goes into another registered childminder's home and they deliver the service together. But it's more common for those who are above the 6 size to have assistants. The further you go, I mean, have in Scotland is for 54 children and employees and maintain those ratios. Where you find those larger settings, it tends to be areas where there's no other form of childcare available.
And in those larger settings, would they all be on one site, in one home?
Yes.
Or?
Yes.
And are they bespoke settings then, sort of a church hall, or would they be in somebody's home?
No, I mean, childminding legally, the definition of childminding is it can only be delivered on domestic premises. So where you have larger childminding settings, it's basically in a large house, where it's almost like mini childminding groups within that delivered together to maintain the ratios.
In terms of remuneration, how well paid are childminders?
It's not a high-income profession. I mean, we undertook some research back in 2022, which found that at that time that only 13% of the childminding workforce could pay themselves a real living wage. We do believe things have been improving, but most people who become childminders do so not for the pay. They do it more, they see it as a vocation. It's something they really want to make a difference, but also if it fits with their life at that time. You know, if they have young children they want to care for themselves, they want that flexibility of you can choose their hours, they can be their own boss working from home. But what's quite interesting is quite a few people go into childminding, perhaps think they'll only stay while their own children are young, but actually continue practicing for 20, 30 years.
And who tends to use childminders? Obviously, it's parents and carers, but what, you know, is there a particular demographic?
No, not at all. I mean, I think with childminding, there are still some outdated misperceptions in terms of, is it babysitting, is it looking after? It's so much more, is it? It's a very high quality form of childcare. So what it says, it's an informed choice. It tends to be for parents who have some knowledge of childminders, access that, and when they do access it, they really want to stay with it. They find it a very high quality form of childcare.
And is it used, or is it prevalent in particular areas, for example, rural versus urban, or is it evenly spread?
It's evenly spread. I think as with other forms of childcare, childminding businesses have been relatively more difficult to establish in low-income communities in terms of where perhaps people don't have the same level of confidence to actually establish their own business, don't have the same opportunity. So we've been doing a lot of work to try and sort of develop childminding businesses more in low-income areas, but they're fairly evenly spread around the country, both urban and rural, and across sort of socio-economic backgrounds as well.
And if you could go on to explain, you touched on funding a moment ago. If you could explain how places are funded with childminders.
Most places are privately funded, but it's also, you were asking earlier about the business model. Within childminding setting, you could have babies, you could have 1-year-olds, you could have 2-year-olds. Then when you get to 2 to 4-year-olds, you could have some children who access their statutory entitlement of funded ELC from the Scottish Government. So that's part of the income. But there'll also be private arrangements. Not all parents use funded ELC. They prefer to sort of make their own arrangements. Then when you get to 5 to 12 for school-aged childcare, again, that's predominantly private placements as our additional support needs. So it really is a mixed business models that most childminders have within that. There's not one standard model as such. It's very variable.
And you've mentioned in your statement blended placements. Could you please explain what that is?
Yes, a blended placement is a split placement between two different forms of childcare. So again, many parents, one of the reasons that parents choose to use childminding is that they feel quite guilty about having to work. By having a child care for in another home, it's replicating that home-from-home family experience. So that's why a lot of parents choose childminding. And some parents, particularly of 1 and 2-year-olds, perhaps feel that their child wouldn't settle in a nursery for 7 or 8 hour days. It'd be quite long for them. So some parents prefer to actually have a mix where a child will spend part of the time within a nursery and part of the time within a childminding setting. Many childminders also provide what's called wraparound care, which can be either before school or after school as well. So there's a lot of flexibility around these models. What I would say is that childminding is much more flexible generally than nursery provision, in the sense where you have local authority nurseries perhaps still close at 3:30. You may have private nurseries open till 5 or 6. Childminders can work longer days. They're very responsive to families. What they've found is that parents have increasingly flexible working patterns which they've needed to respond to. So they really try to sort of tailor their care to the families.
We touched on earlier the dramatic decline in the childminding workforce, which started pre-pandemic. Could you please explain what the reasons for that?
Yes, the childminding workforce in Scotland has been declining since 2016. The reasons are multifactorial. One of the main policy sort of backgrounds we've had is that during this period, the Scottish Government has been expanding the statutory entitlement of funded early learning and childcare. So up until about 2016, parents in Scotland could access about 600 hours of funded childcare each week. What the Scottish Government committed to do in 2016 was really ambitious. It was to almost double that statutory entitlement to 1,140 hours a week, roughly 22 hours a day, for parents of all 3 and 4-year-olds and what are called eligible 2-year-olds. So it was low-income families and vulnerable children. So it was a really ambitious policy which we were supportive of. It's about closing attainment gap, supporting parents. But many childminders found it very difficult to operate, if you like, during the expansion of funded ELC. We've been on record to previous inquiries that we're supportive of ELC policy, but the manner in which it's been implemented has been really challenging for childminders. The Scottish Government commissions us annually to undertake an annual independent audit to monitor local authorities' progress, and including childminders, in delivering funded ELC. And what we've been doing is tracking the workforce during this period. So between 2016 and I think it was last year, our workforce declined about 41%. So in real terms, that's about we've lost about 1,300 places for families. We've lost about 2,300 childminding businesses. That has been really serious. Now, the reasons are multifactorial. Part of it, we have an ageing workforce. 1 in 5 of childminders are currently 55 plus. Many childminders found it difficult to compete with the expansion of funded early learning and childcare. Some local authorities were inclusive, others less so. So it's been quite a challenging environment. But also there was a national recruitment drive to recruit new workers into the workforce to support the expansion of funded ELC. What it was anticipated and hoped for is it would bring lots of new workers into the sector. Instead, what hadn't been anticipated is that it actually had a bit of a destabilising effect. What we found was that early years practitioners working in private nurseries who'd been on lower pay, people working in social care on lower pay, childminders, again, were attracted by the higher pay available in local authority nurseries. So we had this sort of inadvertent destabilisation of our workforce as well. So it's when you run those factors together, they've all sort of contributed collectively to the decline in our workforce.
Excuse me. Then in terms of the functions of the SCMA and the work you did during the pandemic, In paragraphs 16 to 17 of your statement, you describe the type of support and representation that you provided for members. And then later in paragraph 39, you describe the sorts of things that SCMA did over the pandemic. And you mention in particular, just wait till they get there, at 4, you mention the fact that you did regular surveys of members to understand the impact of operating restrictions on childminding businesses and families. I'm going to come on to ask you to tell us a bit more about that, but just if you could give an indication of how many and what sort of types of surveys, what were you asking?
I mean, first of all, when the pandemic struck and schools closed and we managed to keep childminding open on a reduced capacity, we undertook a survey to find out how many childminding settings were still open, who were willing to stay open to support the national response. But it was more as the pandemic progressed. There were a lot of operating restrictions due to the pandemic which changed frequently in relation to and in response to the public health advice. So we would undertake regular snapshot surveys of our workforce to understand the impact, the operational impact of different restrictions on our business, whether that was financial, whether it was practical in terms of how they operate, to capture data to inform ongoing discussions with Scottish Government, local authorities and others, so we could actually understand what was happening on the ground. Similarly, we undertook surveys specifically on childminders' business sustainability to actually understand what was the financial impact of some of these restrictions. So it very much depended on where we were. You spoke about blended placements earlier. That was another example where the restrictions on blended placements during the first national lockdown had a very significant impact on childminding businesses at that time. So we captured snapshot data really to inform discussions with Scottish Government. I mean, where we come from, we are a national advocacy representative body, but we try to be as evidence-based as we can. So it's very much about trying to capture data to inform discussions and then to try and influence change on behalf of childminders and the families that they support.
Thank you. If we could then turn to have a bit of a discussion about the impact of closures on childminders and childminding operations. In terms of closures, I think in March 2020, ELC settings were closed except for vulnerable children and children of key workers. And in paragraph 45 of your statement, you say then that SCMA did a snapshot survey of its members to find out which were open or willing to be open. So this was one of the surveys you mentioned. Could you describe the situation of your members during that period, March 2020, between March 2020 and June 2020, when they were able to reopen with guidance?
Yes, of course, I'll try to.
And if I could just ask you, if in that discussion, if you could give an indication of approximately how many remained open and why, what considerations were taken into account, and any particular issues or challenges they faced. It's quite a loaded question, but it means you can capture it all in one.
Please, if you don't mind prompting me if I don't cover all points. One of the first things to say is what's not widely known is that childminding stayed open more than any other form of childcare during COVID-19. The reason for that was largely due to the smaller setting size. Because most childminding settings have no more than 6 children at any one time, it was recognised at a public health level that the risk of transmitting COVID in a childminding setting was less than in larger settings. So initially, when schools and nurseries were instructed to close nationally, childminding was allowed to stay open on a normal basis. In reality, that probably only continued for about a week, 10 days max. For more than 2 families, but no more than 2 at one time. So when we did that first snapshot survey, we found probably about 700-800 childminders who were quite keen to stay open. Now, the reasons for that were different in the sense that prior to the pandemic, a lot of childminding businesses are quite vulnerable financially. You know, they'd struggled during expansion of funded ELC, as I mentioned earlier. They were quite nervous that if they closed, they might not reopen. For us as a membership organisation, if we'd had to close, reopen months later to a much reduced membership, we would have come back to a very different place. But because we had the opportunity to support childminders to stay open, we really thought it was an opportunity to support families to as much as we could. So we undertook regular surveys over the 3 months of the national lockdown, and it averaged between 700 and 1,000 settings were open at any one time, and we supported those settings. As I said, The capacity was reduced. What we had at a national level was criteria for key workers. Again, it varied locally, subject to interpretation. But it was predominantly NHS staff, people, frontline staff from a range of professions who we were able to care for. But also what we found, particularly health professionals, doctors and nurses, became increasingly interested in childminding because there was less risk of transmitting infection in their setting. There was quite a lot of demand. They actually preferred that and going to a larger hub. So the childminders that stayed open, it was a really challenging period. We had rapidly changing operating guidance. We were involved nationally, along with the Scottish Government, Care Inspectorate and Public Health Scotland, in developing what was called the Childminding Services Guidance. So that was the operating guidance that really dictated how childminding could operate throughout the pandemic. And there was over 30 iterations of that, really long documents, 56 pages. But also childminders who stayed open, their practice was very different because they were operating not just with reduced capacity, there was enhanced cleaning of every aspect of their setting, toys. There was instructions in terms of where shoes, coats had to be kept separate, again to minimise, because at that time there was a strong emphasis on believing that COVID-19 was transmitted by surface contact, whereas latterly it was more the evidence of shown airborne. But initially there was a huge emphasis on any form of surface contact. So childminders had to undertake enhanced cleaning, which could add 2 hours to the day. So childminders who stayed open could be working from easily 8 in the morning till 9 at night. They then had to deal with all these changes to the operating guidance that were coming through, updates from multiple bodies. And it was a really confusing environment because, just speaking objectively, this is not critical at all, our experience of the pandemic is that the pandemic moved at such a pace that the Scottish Government had no choice but to make national announcements that restrictions were going to be implemented. And on an operational level, we knew the detail had not been worked out yet in terms of what did that actually mean for providers. So in simple terms, can I stay open? Parents wanted to know, is it safe to drop my children off? If childminders were able to stay open, under what basis? So it was really challenging. So we had quite a lot of communication vacuums where sometimes it could be 3 or 4 days before we'd actually get guidance coming through from the Care Inspectorate in terms of what this meant. So what we tried to do was to step in and manage these communication vacuums because they can be damaging, quite dangerous when you have those situations. We didn't always have the answer, but what we set out to do was to get the answer. What we wanted to do was to maintain trust. Childminders, it's very isolating. They work on their own. They were staying open, but also childminding is different from, say, like a hub, for example, in the sense that a childminding setting is also a childminder's home. So we had this unknown quantity in the forms of COVID-19, and the childminders who stayed open were willingly taking children into their setting, into their family home, when their own family were present. And that was something that really wasn't recognised at the time. So we did as much as we could to support childminders. It was hugely challenging during that period. There was so much information coming through that childminders just simply didn't have the time to read the guidance. But it was fundamentally important. They needed to know what was safe, what was good practice at that time. So we had to improvise. We found that communication channels were getting blocked. There were so many organisations sending things out. So I found myself improvising where I would actually sort of pull out with my team key points from an update to the guidance, what the changes are, record them on my mobile phone, we'd upload it to YouTube, and then we'd put it out on Facebook, which was the primary communications medium for childminders. And before the pandemic, if we'd produced a video, you'd be lucky to get 200 or 300 views. During the pandemic and a national lockdown, 3,000 or 4,000 people were following these videos. It wasn't just childminders, it was local authority staff, care inspectorate inspectors, parents. What we tried to do was develop a quality assured source of information on childminding during that time and to support childminders the best we could during that period. So I've probably waffled a bit, but have I answered your question?
Probably answered. We can probably just finish right there. So. No, thank you. That's very comprehensive. I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned virtual contact. If your members were operating as hubs, was that just for key worker, or not hubs, but critical childcare? In the first lockdown, was that just for children of key workers and or vulnerable children?
When the hubs were, basically when the schools closed, schools were repurposed as hubs for delivering critical childcare. So that was really children of key workers or vulnerable children. thought was initially given to would it be possible for childminders to actually go to the hub, participate in delivering care there. But again, if you go back to the legal definition of what a childminder is, it's on domestic premises. That's what the registration is for with the Care Inspectorate. So it was recognised that childminders couldn't deliver from a hub, so they had to do it from home. But the families that they supported during those 3 months of the national lockdown were predominantly key workers, also some vulnerable children, but also there was some informal agreements reached with local authorities where, for example, if you maybe had a child with additional support needs who had already been in that setting before the pandemic, if there was a space in that setting without taking them over capacity, sometimes your children who weren't children of key workers were allowed to continue in those settings. So there was some discretion there involved. Similarly, we operate what are called community childminding services, which are, we have contracts with local authorities to support vulnerable families. It's really for families who are perhaps one step away from crisis. Whatever's going on at a parental level, it could be mental health, addiction, bereavement, terminal illness, is impacting on young children. They're perhaps developing attachment disorders. That's been picked up by social workers or health visitors, and they refer to our specialised services for support. So that was not within the scope of critical childcare or vulnerable children, but we got agreement that where we had these community childminding services in place, that they could continue during the national lockdown, provided we didn't go above capacity in terms of the number of children in those settings. But what we also did was, again, try to support other families as much as possible, in the sense that childminding wasn't unique, but we were an outlier in terms of staying open during the national lockdown. Many organisations within the children's sector, family sector, had to close down. Women's Aid, Home Start, they weren't allowed to deliver physical support for families. So we managed to secure funding from the Scottish Government. It was called a Wellbeing Fund, where we were actually able to take referrals from other charities such as Women's Aid, where there was an acute need for support, because our childminding settings were open. The numbers weren't large. I think we supported about 50 additional families that way, but it was really important to make a difference, because what wasn't widely known at the time, but I think the Scottish Government has subsequently published the data for, is that the estimates that were, during the first, few weeks of the national lockdown, perhaps even the first half of the national lockdown, probably no more than about 5% of vulnerable children in Scotland were actually receiving support, physical or virtual. There was a very high level of need, so anything we could do or others could do to try to support vulnerable families, we did.
And in terms of uptake by vulnerable families with your childminding services, was that also relatively low compared to how it would be in?
No, I'd say before the pandemic, historically, before I came into SCMA in 2019, I think historically SCMA had community childminding services in quite a number of local authority areas. Currently we only have services in 4 areas. What we found was that during the expansion of funded early learning and childcare, which I mentioned earlier, local authorities were prioritising their interest, very much having to think, we have this big policy, we have to deliver it. So some local authorities were switching their focus, their interest and their funding from community childminding to what they needed to do to support ELC expansion. So as we went into the pandemic, we had 4 community childminding services. They were already at capacity. There was quite a high level of demand from vulnerable families. The pandemic intensified that acutely. What we found, and it's been reported by other organisations during the pandemic, is you had a lot of families who, prior to the pandemic, were just coping, but you had a pressure cooker effect, that when you had a pandemic, people were at home, couldn't get out, they then went over into really, in need of support. And we couldn't support all the families we wanted to. The demand was way beyond what we could support at that time.
If we could perhaps move on then, Mr. McAlister, to consider, and I think some of the issues you've already touched on, but June 2020, when childminders were allowed to reopen beyond critical childcare and restrictions, did they have to close again at any point after that?
Not as such. It was quite a confusing period, because as we came out for the first national lockdown, the main emphasis was really on when could schools reopen. When you have a national pandemic, it was an extended national emergency, As you'll be aware, exams were cancelled, schools closed. So that was a real priority and goal, if you would like, was trying to get schools open in August. So childminding was allowed to reopen first, I think, along with outdoor nurseries, because again, it was believed there was less risk in those settings. But what we found was that over the next few months, capacity, the restrictions incrementally eased and incrementally improved in terms of the number of children we could have in our settings, but the restrictions on blended placements remain, and that was a really core part of childminding business and really affected them financially. So, so I've slightly lost track of the question you asked, Laura Jane.
It was just whether you had to close again after the first lockdown.
No, I mean, I think
did you remain open?
Individual settings had to close individually, quite often due to self-isolation. So again, if there was an outbreak in their setting, if they had an infected child come into their setting, as they were told, they had to self-isolate. So it was quite common for childminders to report they maybe had to self-isolate 4 or 5 times over a period of months. They weren't closed formally again, in the sense that when we got, I think it was in December of 2020, when we all went back into level 4 restrictions, childminding was allowed to stay open at that time, as we were during the later Omicron outbreak. Where there were restrictions were on larger childminding settings. So if you had more than 12 children in your setting, you did have to change. You had to reduce your capacity, and those larger settings had to follow the operating guidance that had been developed for nurseries and other larger settings. But childminding was largely able to stay open once we reopened in June 2020.
Thank you. Well, we'll come on to discuss now some of the issues that they faced in that period from June 2020 onwards, which you discuss in paragraph 60 to 96 of your statement. I'll ask you to elaborate on some of those. Some of them you've touched on already. But in paragraph 67 and 68, you refer to the fact that in June and July 2020, SCMA conducted a survey because the Scottish Government had not indicated what would happen in relation to blended places. And I'm going to come on in a second to ask you a bit more about blended places. But you say you got responses from 1,300 members, and only 20% of the workforce believed their businesses would still be viable in 12 months' time if restrictions continued after schools went back. I'm going to ask you, were those concerns related specifically to blended restrictions on blended placements, or more generally?
No, it was very much around blended placements because, again, the early sort of public health advice during the pandemic was there was a preference to maintain children or adults in small bubbles and to minimise movement between bubbles. So that was why during a national lockdown there was a very firm, blended placements were just not allowed unless absolutely necessary to support key workers. So they just really didn't happen. And this had been, when you looked at it from a local authority nursery perspective, it's perhaps a small part of the business. But within childminding, it's much more pronounced. It's quite common. Particularly, childminders will, care for babies, 1-year-old, 2-year-olds. When children get to 3 or 4, parents perhaps start to feel some other pressures, actually thinking, well, which nursery is my child going to go to? Which school are they going to go to? If I'm wanting to get to that school, is it perhaps better they start attending a nursery attached? There's all sort of those historic dynamics that, we've moved on from a lot of that, but parents were actually feeling quite a lot of pressures around that at that time. But what we've found is that because those just blended placements were not allowed, when our members were really concerned, because it was great they were told they can reopen. There was a lot of discussion about when the schools could reopen, but what nobody was looking at was, well, the blended placements, and that was like the real crunch point for us, if you would like, for childminders. So we undertook a snapshot survey, got a really good response, and I think what that found was that childminders reported having lost about 1,200 children from their settings during a national lockdown. In practical terms, because blended placements weren't allowed, parents were basically being told, well, you can either choose a childminding setting or a nursery. And when you look at all of those pressures I've been describing, thinking, well, future I want to go to that school, parents reported to us they almost felt pressured or almost forced into actually choosing nursery over childminding. And a lot of these places didn't come back. And that was a core part of childminders' businesses. But they needed to know when blended placements could come back. But also what we'd found is that quite often during a pandemic there were disparities between what was in the sector-specific operating guidance and what was in the social guidance for the wider public. So there were times when our childminders would regularly report to us that they were still being told by the Childminding Services guidance they had to maintain the bubbles, and yet much wider movement was being allowed out in social areas, people going to restaurants, pubs, different things. That was quite difficult to reconcile for all of us at that time. And again, it's not a criticism, it's just an observation of where we were. But it was very challenging for childminders businesses who relied on that income. So we had to really push and advocate, try and get clarity from the Scottish Government as soon as we could to know when those restrictions would be removed. Finally, over a period of weeks, we got confirmation that the restrictions would be eased by the time the schools went back. But the wording was not supportive. It wasn't saying, blinded placements are allowed. It was forcing it to us. Just simply their experience during the pandemic. On their terms, which again, the way it was. And so what we did is, where there was consent with local authorities, blinded placements coming back. But even looking at the are low.
You, Mr. McAlister, the issue of, you mentioned financial issues facing. Could you elaborate? Larger ones were having to, what numbers were allowed, and which sized businesses was this affecting? Was it all of them, or was it just the larger ones?
In terms of business sustainability, I mean, it was most childminders were very concerned, in the sense that they'd had, those who'd stayed open during the national lockdown had only been to care for children from 2 families at any one time, so that was quite a sizable hit in their income. When they were allowed to reopen back in June 2020, I think it was, I think the numbers increased incrementally to 3-4 children. It took some time before we got back up to the 6. So there was all that sort of impact you'd had really between March and then probably the autumn of 2020, when they'd had decreased income. But also there were differentials, in the sense that if you were known as what's a partner provider and you were contracted to deliver funded early learning and childcare to families in your area, a decision was taken quite early on in the pandemic by the Scottish Government and COSLA to actually confirm that the funding would continue for these placements, even if providers chose to close. So if you're a funded provider, you could have chosen to close during the 3 months of the pandemic, still get paid for children who would have been receiving funded ALC. If you were not delivering funded ALC, it was a very different picture. You had no income. So we really had to work and try and capture information. And again, it varied by individual business model in terms of who was more affected than others. Similarly, when it came to financial support, what we tended to get was waves of financial support from the UK government to the Scottish government. Different funds would be created, and it was really just trying to positively influence those as much as possible. We also had to improvise. I mean, as a charity, we released at one point about 30,000 from our reserves, and got match funding from the Scottish government, and we established a hardship fund to just pay small grants of £350. That was the childminders who were falling through the cracks between different funding sources. It's a very small sum of money, but if you had no money coming in, that made a difference. And that was actually scaled up. But again, there were just differentials throughout. So it's quite difficult to answer your question. Have I?
Yes, well, in terms of being restricted to 2 households at any one time, the smaller single sole practitioner childminders, how many would they normally have? How many children or how many households would they normally be allowed? Again,
it would be variable. I mean, if you are registered to care for no more than 6 children at any one time, you could have that maximum throughout the day. So that could be more than 6 families. You may have 8 or 9 families on your books throughout the week. But again, if you were to go back to the restrictions during the national lockdown, that was really pared back to probably about 1/3 of that. But also there was a lot of other issues as it came out of the pandemic, in the sense that prior to the pandemic, working from home was nowhere near as extensive as it is now. So a lot of parents who had to work from home during the national lockdown, they were given a lot of flexibility, particularly those who were actually having to teach their own children from home. And employers gave that flexibility. So what we found is it was really uncertain as you came out of the pandemic. What was the demand for childcare going to be? It wasn't the same as it was before the pandemic. What we found is some families who perhaps, if their own family income had reduced during the national lockdown, they were actually thinking, could they perhaps save by not paying for childcare? So there was really uncertain demand for quite some time as a result of the pandemic. So that really impacted on them financially as well.
You touched on guidance earlier, and you mentioned in paragraph 91, childminders did not know what was coming through in the massive documents, what had changed, or have time to read them. Could you elaborate a bit on that? You go on then to say how you addressed that, but how big an issue was that for your members?
It was a big issue. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, that for those who'd stayed open, if you're receiving a large guidance document, perhaps 50, 60 pages, at that time the preference from the Care Inspectorate was that providers should read the full document. Whereas we very much recognised you had a core document, which a lot of the content didn't change. What was really important to providers, or what are the changes, what do I need to know? So it was a question of pulling out those key points for providers. And again, it's going back to the comments made earlier about the extended days that childminders are working. They were absolutely overwhelmed, through the enhanced cleaning, working in their setting. They just didn't have the time to read those documents. So it was fundamentally important from a safety point of view, so that childminders didn't breach the terms of registration. So it was a really important sort of interface, if you'd like, almost between policy and practice. And also, as mentioned, we had, I think, 32 iterations of the guidance over the 2-year period.
You also touched on cleaning earlier in the context of the lockdown and the hubs being opened, and you mentioned it as well in the context of opening with restrictions at paragraph 74 onwards. You mentioned earlier the extra time that would need to be spent by childminders doing this additional cleaning. In paragraph 77, you also talk about additional costs complying with the restriction measures. Do you care to elaborate a bit on that as well?
Yes, it was just, as I'd mentioned, the public health focus very early on in the pandemic was a sense that this was an infection that was spread primarily by surface contact. So what that entailed was, very extensive deep cleaning every day of your setting, all surfaces, anything a child had touched literally had to be cleaned before another child could touch it. So toys, books, there were restrictions where childminders couldn't have throws on their sofas in case it spread infection. There was rules around what you could do, as I said, with coats, separate tubs for well-used shoes. It was really, really intense. I mean, I was actually speaking to one of our members recently about giving evidence today, and she actually, to use her words, found it quite triggering. She remembers literally, a child would be playing in her setting, and then once that child put a toy down, she'd be subtly trying to take the toy away and clean it behind the child's back so they didn't see what she was doing, so they wanted to unsettle them. That was their reality. They had to do that every day. And obviously that frequency, that intensity of cleaning, that meant a significant increase in the supplies you were going through. Because that was happening nationally, there was demand everywhere for those supplies. I think there was probably an element of profiteering from some private companies in terms of sensing it as an opportunity. Childminders found it really difficult sometimes to access materials. Again, originally the thought was that they would be able to, during the national response when they stayed open to provide critical childcare, that they might be able to access supplies from the hubs, but in most cases that didn't happen. The Scottish Government did sort of positively arrange for all providers in Scotland be able to access an account where you could access materials at discounted rates. But again, they weren't always available, just in terms of the sheer demand and the level of supply at that time. But it also meant that, childminders quite often, that because of the restrictions on travel as well, they were perhaps going to the local shop to buy these materials rather than being able to travel further afield where they might be able to get it cheaper as well. So there was all sorts of those issues came in, and that was also even more pronounced in remote and rural areas as well, where the costs were more significant.
Before we turn to look at impacts on children, if I could just touch on the impacts that all of this had on your childminders and on the childminding sector. You discussed the impacts on childminders in paragraphs 129 to 145. Could you please outline specifically the reasons for and the impacts on mental health? It's one of the particular issues you
Yes, I think, childminding itself, as I mentioned earlier, just over 8% of childminders are sole practitioners. So childminding had been quite isolating. Before the pandemic, There were maybe about 200 of what we call childminding groups around the country, where childminders would get together with other childminders and their children go out and undertake activities. Those events weren't allowed during the pandemic. So childminders were very much on their own, they were very isolated, they were dealing with the intensity of the situation on their own. But childminders reported to us often felt conflicted. Some felt, they absolutely wanted to stay open. Some felt they had to stay open financially. As I mentioned earlier, a childminding setting is also a childminder's home. So there was also this guilt, this unknown virus in terms of, am I actually exposing my family to additional risk by doing this? They wanted to help. So had all of those issues. But also, during a national response, childminders by default were primarily supporting key workers. Many of those worked in the health. I'd mentioned earlier about the fact that families who've accessed childminding also view it as a form of family support as well as childcare. So what's also been reported to us is that you may have frontline health professionals working in, ICU units who didn't feel able to go home and tell their own families about what they're seeing on a daily basis. They didn't want to worry their families, they didn't want to scare their families, but they would actually tell their childminder because they had such a close relationship. So childminders were actually absorbing all of this, really sort of priding, a safe place to talk, a non-judgmental place to talk for a whole range. They also had their own concerns about business sustainability in terms of would their business still be viable. So all of that contributed very much to, I suppose, an increased instance of mental health. Many childminders really struggled. What we did as an organisation was to facilitate access to counselling. So if childminders really needed to speak to somebody, they could do so. But also what we worked to do as an organisation was to reduce that isolation as much as possible. So we were really trying to reach out, make them feel connected, part of something, so that they weren't on their own, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You also discuss the impact on the childminding workforce at paragraph 129 and following, and you discussed earlier the fact that this was in decline already pre-pandemic. To what extent did the pandemic exacerbate this, or was it always going one way anyway?
I mean, the childminding workforce had been, I think before the pandemic, it declined by about 20-24%. Certainly the first year of the pandemic, we saw a sharp acceleration in terms of that decline. Again, some childminding settings who had been a bit vulnerable financially before the pandemic, it was a final straw for them. If they had to close, if there was a reduction in income, they weren't able to reopen. So that was why, for us, it was quite a strange thing to do now when we look back on it. But prior to the pandemic, we'd actually been developing a sort of a 3-year strategy as part of a longer 10-year journey to reverse the decline in the workforce. And we actually signed it off with our board about 10 days before the pandemic struck. Now, we had to put that strategy to one side. It was the right call. We focused on supporting our workforce. But by the time we got through that first year of the pandemic, we thought we actually have to go out and launch this strategy now, because if we don't, that workforce is just going to go into a level of decline it will not recover from. So in May 2021, we launched that strategy. It was a time when very few in Scotland were looking forward, because we just didn't know if we'd be forced back by restrictions. Sometimes we were, but that was the right call. What that did was bring local authority to us, Scottish Government to us, organisations interested in us thinking, right, what can we do? So we're in a different place now, but the pandemic absolutely accelerated the decline of the childminding workforce.
Thank you. If we can turn now to have a look at impacts on children. You cover this at 97 to 120 of your statement, and at paragraph 97 you preface your comments on the impacts of COVID-19 by noting that there were many organisations involved in data collection, that the SCMA did not want to duplicate other activity, and you make the comment there that Public Health Scotland was leading on capturing data on children's outcomes via surveys and has published 3 reports. And your members' experiences on the impact of children are broadly consistent with these. Could you please explain how did your members report back to you about impacts on children if you weren't carrying out surveys specifically in relation to impacts, and how did you get that information from them about that?
A variety of channels. And we're a membership organisation, so in terms of our communications channels, we have a telephone helpline, we have an email inquiries point. We actively survey members on different areas. We invite contact from our members. We have networking events virtually. We have training events where we capture information. But we also have a number of what we call childminding development officers, who are area staff in different parts of the country. So again, it was also, they're very close to the ground on a daily basis, supporting local childminders with their practice. So via all of those different channels, we were capturing information. So from an evidential point of view, the first thing is to say it's anecdotal. I mean, we went to the point, as I said, there was so much coming through, so many requests for surveys. Childminders simply just didn't have the time at that, and we thought, well, we'd worked closely with Public Health Scotland. They were the experts on this. They were looking at outcomes on children. So what we did, we made a conscious decision that instead of actually surveying our members ourselves, when it came to the impacts on children, we would actually sort of share those surveys, encourage our members to snowball them to parents, try and drive responses as much as we could. And I think, reading those reports that were produced, the findings are broadly consistent with what we experienced anecdotally. But it's also, anecdotal information sometimes can be dismissed from an evidential point of view, but when that continues to increase, even now, when I speak to childminders, 2 years on from the pandemic, if I was to say to them what are the main two impacts on children, the first will be emotional dysregulation, the second will be delay in speech and language at all ages. Childminders are still talking about that, they're still dealing with that. And that was very much the experience during the pandemic, that you had children whose entire life routine was interrupted. They found it really difficult to control their behaviour, different situations, how to react to situations. They didn't have routines that perhaps they would have normally had. And it was also, families were at very different places as well, because I think it'd be a mistake to just think about the national lockdown of, 3 months as being the only impact, because what we had was that first national lockdown. You then had an incremental easing of restrictions. We then had level 4 restrictions in December. You had the Omicron outbreak later. But we also found that families were at very different places. Families who had perhaps been key workers and had been working during the pandemic, it was more normal to them. They were used to going out every day. Their families were used to them going out. But if you hadn't worked for those 3 months, what we found is some families were a bit more nervous. Even though restrictions eased, they were perhaps a bit nervous about actually allowing their children to go back to different settings for fear that they might get an infection. So again, families were all at different places with that. So we just tried to capture as much information as we could, in terms of the main impact. As I said, it really was, the emotional dysregulation, that was the main issue for them.
Well, Sorry, I was just going to say that you've got quite a long list there, but as you say, paragraph 98, that based on feedback, the main adverse impacts were in terms of socialisation, skills and ability. Are you able to elaborate on that a little, please?
Yes, I think in terms of socialisation skills, it's quite interesting because that can be experienced in different age groups, in the sense that you had younger preschool children who perhaps hadn't been able to attend nursery, hadn't been able to attend a childminding setting for a period of months. Depending on the family and how much support they actually received, children are at very different places. But also, because in childminding, childminders care from children from birth through to 12, what childminders were also reporting to us is that for children who were perhaps leaving nursery to go to primary school, in terms of that transition, they didn't have the opportunity to have sort of like a leaving celebration. They didn't have the opportunity of pre-arranged visits to support the transition. Then when you extend it up the scale to those leaving primary, going to secondary, it's the same. You had a cohort of children who perhaps weren't able to access the normal transition opportunities you would have between going from primary school to high school.
So you have transitions down as a
Yes.
separate impact.
Sorry.
Is that related to the socialisation skills?
Yes, very
as
much
well?
so, because I think it was linked to that in the sense that there wasn't the same level of social contact through the transitions. But in terms of actual socialisation themselves, Childminders also reported to us that in terms of older children, that they were just losing their confidence, their ability to interact with others, because they weren't able to physically go to school, they weren't allowed to go out and meet up with friends. There'd be some online contact, but it really affected the confidence, their communication, their ability to engage. So it was all of that aspect of socialisation.
You also mention language and communication. Would you care to elaborate on that and what childminders provide in terms of enrichment and teaching in relation to language and communication?
Childminding, again, I'd mentioned earlier that there can be some outdated misperceptions that it's just babysitting or looking after. it's also a very high quality form of childcare. There's a very high element of learning within childcare settings. One of the benefits of smaller childminding settings is that because of the number of children in their settings, the children won't necessarily receive one-to-one support, but they'll definitely have more personalised support. Childminders will have more time to spend with individual children if they recognise there's an area where they perhaps benefit their development. And also, as I said, because you have children of different ages, you would actually have perhaps an older child, maybe 5 or 6, sitting reading to a 2-year-old. You would have younger children picking up the language being used by older children. So again, you had that interaction within childminding settings. But again, it's, you know, when we look at the literature now, I think the emphasis has very much been on delayed language in younger children, and you know, we would agree with that. But equally, I know our own members would immediately say to me, no, you know, across all age groups, you know, it's what they experienced, and it's very much anecdotal.
You mentioned play at paragraphs 105 to 108, and we've heard something about play already in the hearings. To what extent, how important is play in relation to the activities that childminders provide, and what impacts were they seeing as a consequence of
play? Is hugely important. I mean, sometimes it can be almost not dismissed, but perhaps viewed as not as important in learning. We would actually argue with that quite strongly, that play really supports learning. It's hugely important. And within childminding, as I said, it can be very child-led. There's a high element of play, but a lot of that play is also outdoors within childminding settings. It's going out exploring, it's playing in the garden, going out to local woods. So that is a very strong part of childminding. It's comparatively easier for a childminder to go out with a small group of children than it would be for a nursery to arrange a group outing, if you would like. So play to us is massively important. And again, I think one of the adverse impacts of the pandemic, particularly in relation to outdoors, was that families who perhaps higher income, who had larger houses, had gardens, COVID-19 was a much better experience for those families. They actually report to us there was a higher quality of life. They enjoyed spending time together with their families. If you compare that with a family, a low-income family in a flat, that doesn't have a garden, there's no park nearby, you're not allowed to go out very often, it was a very different experience for those families. So those families were not able to access the outdoors, and it, in turn, experienced as much play.
Thank you. And you have quite a few on the list, and we won't probably have time to go through all of them. But feeding and eating, for example, is one. How was that impacted based on feedback from your members?
Again, what members reported to us is that it's very common in childminding settings for children to sit and eat together, and for the childminder to be with them, because a lot of language, communication, development takes place through that interaction when those children of different ages are together. But due to the pandemic, if a child wasn't able to access a childminding setting, again, it's all interlinked. They lost the routine, they lost that opportunity. When it came to food, and again, it's only anecdotal, but the reports we have is, again, that with lower income families, that they may not have perhaps been able to access the nutrition they might have done if they'd been attending the childminding setting. So again, there was quite a few challenges around that as well.
Are there any other on the list? It's quite language and communication, personal skills, sleeping, parental engagement, relationships, digital exclusion, or positive impacts you'd like to touch on before we move on to our final topic?
No, I mean, I think we've covered most of them. As I said, I'm probably sound like a stuck record, but if I'm speaking on behalf of childminders, it's very much the emotional dysregulation, the delayed speech and language, where the impacts we're still looking at, what training courses do we need to provide now to support childminders, just in turn support those children and the families who lost out during the pandemic.
And I think you mentioned, but are there any that your members are still reporting? Is it the whole list that they're still reporting seeing, or are there specific ones on the list that have sort of
It's still mainly those areas that we're focusing on just now.
I'd just finally like to turn to just look at some of the disproportionate impacts that you mentioned. You've touched on already community childminding. At paragraph 125, though, you talk about children with additional support needs. Could you please elaborate on the disproportionate impacts on those children?
I mean, I possibly touched a little on that earlier, in the sense that during the national lockdown, when the emphasis was very much on critical childcare, that it was a mixed experience in the sense that if a child with additional support needs had previously been in the childminding setting before the pandemic, if there was capacity with reduced numbers for that place to continue, they could get a place. But if that hadn't been an arrangement, they couldn't access support. So it was very much, it was quite a wide difference in terms of the support that children with additional support needs could get at that time.
And you've touched on the importance in rural areas, but you have that down as well at paragraph 126. Do you have any further comments on that in relation to disproportionate impacts?
Again, I think that's very much linking it in with the childminding workforce. I'd mentioned earlier in terms of the cost of cleaning materials. Remote and rural areas, it's quite common, unfortunately, now due to the childcare crisis in some areas, for parents having to drive 40, 50 miles to access childcare. The cost of petrol can be dearer. The cost of food can be dearer. And what we'd found is that when we actually looked at the decline of the childminding workforce, it was very much more pronounced in remote and rural areas. That was why after we launched our strategy in 2021, we had 3 or 4 remote and rural local authorities come to us looking, can you help? So since then, we've gone out, we've piloted a new model of childminder recruitment. We prioritised remote and rural areas. That's now gone urban and national, but it's very much in response to that pronounced need.
And are there any other groups that were disproportionately impacted as a consequence of the lockdown and other restrictions and not being able to access childminding services?
I probably don't have much more to say on that. It's probably more childminders themselves who feel there was a disproportionate impact on them, in the sense that when we look at the data in terms of the number of childminders who are involved in delivering funded ELC, we're now only looking at probably about 25–30% of the workforce. When we went into the pandemic, the numbers were lower. So when it came to, for example, like financial support, as I said, funding was confirmed almost immediately, continuity payments for funded providers. When it came to additional relief and transitional support fund, again, the bulk of the funding was for other providers. So I think a lot of childminders reported to us that they felt if you weren't involved in the ELC, there was a disproportionate on themselves impact on their activities. And it was the same, when it came to funding sources, when you looked at in terms of the UK government, first of all, they prioritised the job retention scheme and the furlough for employers. Then there'd be a lot more lobbying to get the self-employed income support scheme. But even when you looked at that, it wasn't what it was sold as, if you'd like. On the surface, the self-employed income support scheme was supposed to provide about 70% of income. It wasn't. It was 70% of profit. So if you're a low-income business, 70% of profit's not much. And the data we have showed that perhaps it was paid quarterly. Childminders would be lucky to get like a month out of 3 months. If you were then if you're a carer, if you had maternity leave, if you had any interruption in sort of your self-employed tax history, again, it affected the payment you got. So childminders just felt at each turn they were disproportionately affected. With the blended placements I was talking about earlier, again, because nationally and understandably, the main priority was reopening schools, reopening nurseries. Childminders are a much smaller part of the workforce, so they kind of felt deprioritised. So when it came to looking at getting schools reopened, of course that was priority. But what they needed was support and blended placements, and that wasn't there at the time. So that was we had to keep pushing. So I think they just, as a workforce, childminding does feel disproportionately impacted.
Well, are there any other matters or lessons to be learned that your members would want to draw to the inquiry's attention? Because I think we've covered everything that I had intended to do with you.
I mean, in terms of lessons learned, I mean, there was quite a lot for us around communications, in the sense that, as I said earlier, we recognised that communications vacuums can be dangerous. It was really challenging for the Scottish Government and others because they didn't have access to the normal press channels. So, if you're a Scottish Government directorate, you're trying to get something out. You had 2 options. One was in the First Minister's daily televised briefing, and there was massive competition from every policy area. Or you had what was called a Provider Update, which was an electronic newsletter from the Care Inspectorate. So the Scottish Government found it really frustrating. They couldn't get the information out. So we channeled a lot of that for them. So I think it's important for us that, we've changed as an organisation in the sense that we didn't have the answers, but we reassured people would get them. And I think there's much more openness, in the sense that we've seen that since the pandemic, that people are willing to admit that perhaps we did things wrong. I think for us, the other challenge, and it was really difficult, was that by default, the Scottish Government, prior to the pandemic, the main childcare priority had been expansion of funded ELC. There was a statutory duty and responsibility of local authorities to deliver that by August 2020. The pandemic struck just a few months before that. So that statutory duty was removed, but understandably, the Scottish Government was keen to bring that back on. But for childminders, what they were reporting to us is that they just felt that each stage of the process, as I've articulated, that the priority was very much given to funded providers. And it was very much, it was difficult to balance, because, there was regular discussions about when do we think we'd be able to reintroduce the statutory and duty on local authorities, can we do that? And I just felt at times that the desire to complete the delivery of the expansion of ELC dominated some of the decisions, some of the discussions that were taking place. And certainly childminders do feel that if you're not involved in delivering funded ELC, that they lost out at each turn, whether it was financial support or other areas. So I suppose from our point of view, it's just probably recognising a challenge, you have a policy to deliver, but also looking at the whole workforce and trying not necessarily prioritising one group.
Thank you very much, my Lord. Unless your Lordship has anything, I have no further questions.
Very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. McAlister. I'm very grateful for your evidence. We'll take a break now, and we'll come back at 11:30 when we're going to hear, I understand, Ms. van Vesterhuizen, a panel of witnesses, 3 witnesses.
That's right, my Lord.
Very good. 11:30 then.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hello, my lord.
Now, good morning again, Ms Van den Westhuizen. Now, as you told us, we have a panel of witnesses.
We do, my lord. We have three witnesses, but all three are former presidents of the National Union of Students Scotland. We have Mr. Liam McCabe, Mr. Matt Crilly, and Miss Ellie Gomersall.
Very good. Good morning to you all.
Morning.
Morning.
I've partially introduced you, but if I could ask you, perhaps starting with Mr. McCabe, to just introduce yourselves, giving your full names and the years in which you were presidents.
Yes. My full formal name is William John McCabe, known as Liam McCabe, and I was president of the National Union of Students for Scotland between 2018 and 2020, so just catching the last 4 months, so the first 4 months of the pandemic.
Good morning, I'm Matthew, or Matt Crilly. I was NUS Scotland President formally between July 2020 until July 2022.
Morning, my name is Ellie Gomersall, and I was the President of the National Union of Students in Scotland from July 2022 to June 2024.
Thank you. And Ms. Gomersall and Mr. Crilly, you were both students as well for part of the time. So if you could please just let us all know where you were, what you were studying, and I think you were presidents of your respective student unions as well.
Yes, that's right. So I was a physics with education undergraduate student at the University of the West of Scotland, started in 2018, and then I took a break from my studies in summer 2021, and from July 2021 until June 2022, I was president of the UWS Students' Union.
I was president of the University of Strathclyde Student Association until my election in the spring of 2020 to the NUS Scotland position. But alongside holding the role of NUS Scotland during the pandemic, I also was a postgraduate master's student in history at the University of Strathclyde, and I completed my dissertation during the pandemic as well.
Thank you. So for the two of you, you'll presumably bring your perspective as former presidents, but also your perspective of having been students at the time as well. If I could ask Ms. Gomersall just to start and sort of set the scene to tell us, explain NUS's membership, how many members, what the structure looks like.
Yeah. So the National Union of Students in Scotland is part of the National Union of Students across the UK, and NUS UK is a membership organisation made up of student associations and student unions. So it's the student union or the student association, which is the member of the National Union of Students in Scotland. So that would be the student associations for any college or university across the country, as well as the National Society of Apprentices as well, which represents apprentices across the UK. In Scotland, NUS Scotland had, throughout, I think, all of our terms as president, 100% membership among the college student associations, and among the university student associations, all bar, I believe, 4 of the university student associations across Scotland were members throughout our times as president.
Thank you. And in terms of the ones that weren't, what engagement was there, if any, with them?
I would maybe ask Matt to come in on this one.
Yeah, of course. So we had strong engagement with those student unions that were not NUS Scotland members. We are traditionally a membership organisation, but of course with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we realised that there was a real need for, to disseminate information, public health information, to ensure that we were bringing people in. So we held weekly or fortnightly officer calls, which of student officers around the country, bringing them together. And again, there was invitations extended to those student unions that were non-members of NUS Scotland. And so too, when we had official engagements with the likes of the National Clinical Director, for example, who would come in and provide public health advice to students, we would invite in the kind of non-NUS member student associations, so that really all student officers across Scotland got access to that really critical public health advice, but also some of the kind of government engagement too, at that time, just recognising the kind of special circumstances of the pandemic.
Thank you. And just in terms of numbers of students overall that you were representing, and it may have varied at the time to time, but what is the approximate number of students that were?
Approximately 500,000 across Scotland. As I say, NUS Scotland, being part of NUS UK, would also represent significantly more in the millions across the UK, but specifically in Scotland, the number was around roughly just over 500,000.
Thank you. If I could ask perhaps Mr. McCabe to come in on this one. Effectively, we're going to move through a few subjects of particular interest that have been raised in your respective witness statements. But I think the first one, if I could ask Mr. McCabe to talk about your experience, because obviously you were there at the start of the first lockdown, you were president at the time, just to give us a flavour of what the experiences were, what the concerns were, what the practical impacts were on students at that time.
For sure. So, as you can imagine, as was the case across, all sectors and all countries affected by COVID, it was incredibly hectic. A lot of confusion, a lot of dismay. In those kind of initial few weeks, where everyone was just kind of trying to understand how best to respond just for everyone's immediate safety before we even got to a place where we're starting to think about how we respond constructively and understand and getting to grips and allowing obviously the scientific community to get to grips with what was happening. For further and higher education specifically, there was a few immediate concerns and impacts that kind of that emerged. The first one, of course, the closure of campuses immediately was a huge consideration. That meant that students who were living in halls of residence and in the accommodation on site were kind of almost kind of trapped a little bit if they hadn't kind of put their finger kind of raised their finger to the wind and seen what way the wind was blowing and decided to move home if that was an option for them. Hither to that point, it meant that a huge amount of resource, which was crucial and vital to a lot of different kinds of students on campus, was just simply no longer available because the shift to providing that in a digital way was not something which had been foreseen at that point for a lot of these services and was not catered for. And also deprivation of access to a lot of key educational infrastructure, of course, as well. Access to libraries, access to labs, access to workshops, and access to vital pieces of software, for example, that a lot of students may not have had the hardware power to run in their own personal devices for certain courses where such things were required. So between concerns about mobility, ability to kind of access basic necessities, and the longer term concerns that then meant, evoked for, well, what is this going to mean for me completing this year of study, and especially for those final year students or students on 1 year courses or students coming up to the end of a PhD or whatever it would be, then well, how is this going to affect my final grade? This was a huge this was a huge concern, naturally and understandably. So generally speaking, that would probably have been the main things that came up, and really what my 4 months at the end of my presidency and working with the government were all about. We're trying to kind of really just make sure everyone was safe, everything was secure, and slowly but surely piecing together how we made sure that students could complete their course of study in a way which reflected their ability and didn't reflect unforeseen difficulties arising from COVID, making sure that certain accommodation issues were handled appropriately and sensitively, and the way which was inclusive of the various needs of students who had outstanding and particular needs. And yeah, that primarily those things, and of course looking out for the mental health, well-being, and physical well-being, and financial well-being of students too, because that was a massive concern.
So really, you were foreshadowing everything then we saw unravelling in the years to come. And I think not to kind of dwell on the kind of the foreshadowing for too long, but certainly when it comes to the financial element, that was a huge deal, because the way that I characterised it was that we were kind of sitting on a ticking time bomb of student deprivation, just because the sectors that students relied upon for financial support were most impacted upon by COVID. Immediately, just everyone lost their jobs in a flash, not just to supplement their income, but also over the summer. And then also there's a cliff where after which point student support ends. And so with that ending and with no clear plan initially
for how that was going to be accommodated for, and no new money available to students during the summer, we were like, how are we going to handle this? What is going to be done about this? And so again, that was incredibly significant part of my 4 months at that time.
Well, I will come on to discuss that specifically, the financial impacts tied in with accommodation. I should, my Lord, just outline what's to follow. I've just realised I haven't foreshadowed that. So we'll be speaking about the move to online and remote learning. We'll then be covering accommodation and financial impacts, which Mr. McCabe has just touched on. We'll then be covering academic impacts, mental health and well-being and social impacts, and then we'll be covering return to campus and ongoing impacts. And just to say that woven through all of those, when we're asking, when you're covering your answers, if you could bear in mind disproportionate impacts, but if we don't touch on them during the course of the discussion, Ms. Gomez will sweep up at the end with ongoing impacts and disproportionate impacts. Thank you. If we could then move to online learning and remote learning and just the specific issues that arose around that. And I think if we ask Mr. Crilly to start and then followed by Ms. Gomersall and then Mr. McCabe, if you have anything to contribute as well to that discussion.
Sure, yeah. So I think when the COVID-19 virus started spreading and we saw the closure, so to speak, of campuses, I think people really understood the desire to move to online when that took place. I think students themselves were at the start of the pandemic really quite frightened actually about this unknown virus and what the potential impacts on themselves, their families, their loved ones, their friends, and so I think there was a lot of confusion at that point about what learning, teaching, assessment would look like. And I think at that point I probably would pay particular credit to the staff across universities and colleges, the kind of teachers, the lecturers, the assessors who did make a very quick pivot as best as they could to move to an online environment, and it was a massive shift. It was a revolution, so to speak, in how education in many ways had been delivered, and our kind of teachers were put in a place to change learning materials, change the way in which classes were delivered or the way assessments were delivered. So I think there's a great deal of credit to be paid there. I think from the student perspective, there were challenges with online learning. There were challenges around accessibility of online learning and teaching and assessment. We heard very early on from students who didn't have exclusive use of a laptop or a digital device in order to take part in their learning. They would usually, under normal circumstances, go onto the campus, their college or university campus, have access to a library, have access to a computer, or the learning materials they need. But with that move to online learning, you didn't have access to those facilities. And so some students did. Some students did have access to laptops and others just simply didn't. And we heard, quite challenging stories of people with whole families kind of locked down in homes, having to kind of find a space in a corridor and join their class on their phone because they didn't have exclusive use of a computer, and finding it really, really challenging in that way. I think too, though, we did hear some feedback from some students, including some disabled students who actually found some of the online learning more accessible, actually, in some ways as well. But I think overall it was a really challenging time, and education was being delivered in a totally different way. And from the student perspective, the shift to online learning had presented a different life to students. So if you're a student, you often enrol in a course to develop many of the soft skills that come through education too. So confidence building, presentation. You perhaps meet lots of different people that you've never met before. you maybe take on some of the additional life experiences, you know, that is sometimes associated with being a student. So you might move out for the first time in your life. You might, you know, meet your life partner and all these sorts of things. And I suppose with the kind of move to online learning through the pandemic and the lockdowns, students didn't necessarily have those life opportunities too, those social opportunities, those opportunities to expand their kind of whole being. Although they did often, again, due to the hard work, I think, of college and university staff, they often did get access to some of the learning online. Finally, I suppose, one of the key challenges during the pandemic was whether or not courses can be delivered in an online way. So there were some subjects where that was easier to make that transition. Some of the humanities subjects, for example, which I was a student in, it was somewhat easier to transition them to an online environment in some cases. But for those students that were studying more practical-based courses, it was very, very hard. It's very hard to train to, you know, take part in a hairdressing course at college online. You know, it was very difficult to learn to become a dentist, to train to become a dentist. It was difficult if you needed access to laboratories, etc., etc. And that's where there was particular challenges through the pandemic, ensuring that those students were supported.
Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, I think Matt has summed that up really, really well, actually, and I'll just maybe take a bit of a deep dive into a couple of those points. So I think, first of all, around the accessibility issue and actually different students having different experiences of the pandemic, which I think is a particularly important issue, because then it widens the gap between different groups of students, and actually it means that it's a lot harder to identify, for instance, which students are you know, whether or not students are actually sort of getting the grades that they deserve, for example. So some students actually really thrived with being able to learn online. So disabled students, for example, who had real issues in terms of accessing a physical campus, being able to actually just travel to campus, being able to afford to get things like the bus or public transport to travel there. Actually, a lot of those issues were all of a sudden mitigated by being able to learn from your home. That's really good for those students. But then actually a lot of students really struggling with that move to online, particularly around things like mental health challenges, that isolation, that loneliness, and the challenges that arise as a result of that. Actually also just in terms of it's a lot harder, and I agree with what Matt said in terms of just paying credit to those teaching staff who really adapted just so phenomenally. But it is much harder for a lot of those, especially those who hadn't taught an online class before, to actually keep that interactive and engaging. And as a result, a lot of students who were neurodiverse, for example, actually really just struggled in terms of being able to engage with, for instance, a 3-hour lecture that's just staring at a screen for 3 hours versus what might be in a classroom in a lecture hall where you can have discussions with people during breaks and things like that makes it more interactive. Some other groups of students had other impacts in terms of being able to learn from home. So, for example, as Matt said, often going to university or college for the first time in particular can be a really sort of liberating experience in terms of finding out who you are, building those social skills. And that's often a time where, for instance, many LGBT plus students might come out, for example, or might start exploring their identities. And as a result of many students having to move back in with parents, for example, who maybe they weren't as comfortable being themselves with, that could actually have significant impacts on their mental health and their well-being too. So there were a number of different impacts that beyond additionally the impacts around digital poverty and not having access to a desk, for example, as well as digital devices, that would be really challenging. So there were a number of issues there in terms of that real disparity that I think really sort of heightened the gap between certain groups of students. Particularly with regards to, so Matt talked about some of the more practical courses. And again, actually, I think, universities and colleges, to their credit, did a really good job in terms of finding sort of innovative ways very quickly to deliver these types of class and these more practical classes online, but it simply wasn't the same. So to use my own personal experience as someone who was studying physics, my class, we had lab sessions that ordinarily we would have been in the lab doing an experiment and then writing up a report. Instead, we were watching a YouTube video of the lecturer doing the experiment and then writing a report based on what they did, and that it makes it so much harder to actually learn when you're not doing it practically yourself. So there was a particular impact there too.
Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose just to touch on at the very big outset of things, how quickly it became apparent that the further and higher education sectors in Scotland simply were not prepared for any kind of meaningful increase in demand in digital infrastructure under these circumstances. I think there are more precise figures laid out in my statement, which I can't summon to mind off the top of my head, but you were finding that even in large universities, you were lucky if there was 100, 200 laptops available for rent or hire among students. And if you're staring at if you're looking at some of the larger universities where you're looking at 19, 20, 22, 25,000 students, that's just not going to touch the sides of what was required. So the infrastructure just simply wasn't there for that move. And not only that, there was scant few institutions who had any kind of meaningful experience or practice in digital provision. You're looking at kind of like, universities, the Highlands and Islands, for example, who use a lot of digital provision because they have to, because of the large geographical space. You're looking at, obviously, the Open University institutions like this. Most universities did not have, and I'm sure there were others who had more experience in that, but those are the two that jump most to mind, perhaps for obvious reasons. But most institutions didn't have that experience, and so that's why, I would like to just add my voice to Ellie and Matt's in terms of commending how quickly lecturers, tutors and all education staff kind of really bent themselves towards trying to deliver as effective a digital education as they possibly could on essentially an improvisational basis, because they themselves had not been given training for that. Even in some cases, access to the software required for that kind of thing just simply wasn't in place. And the quickness with which they were, the willingness that they demonstrated to just try and do something, the right thing, the best thing they could possibly do for as many of their students as possible, was commendable. But certainly that would be the main thing from those, that really, I was really taken aback by as NUS Scotland President in those first 4 months, just how poorly provisioned Scottish colleges and universities were when it came to actually providing the facilities that students required when, as has been mentioned previously, they couldn't access a library, they couldn't access a lab, they couldn't access the software they usually would have access to. But I'm sure we can touch on what I'm sure we will touch on what the implications for that were on attainment and things like that as well as we progress.
And you made a good point there as well about the certain universities being set up for it, because one thing we have heard is that online learning is something specific. Remote learning is really what was happening. Online learning is something that's designed to be delivered online, not an ad hoc emergency.
Totally different pedagogical approach, yeah.
Yes. If we could then maybe turn to have a discussion about financial impacts and accommodation. Obviously that encompasses a multitude, so I'll leave it to you to decide what the main impacts were from your perspectives. But yes, you touched on initially about the exacerbation of existing poverty and job loss, but then there's the housing aspect as well. So I don't have a note of who would go first on this, but perhaps we can start. Do you have an indication of who'd like to start? Mr. Crilly?
I think as Mr. McCabe touched on at the start, there was an accommodation impact at the outset of the COVID-19 outbreak, insofar as students living in purpose-built student accommodation did not have the legal right to provide notice to terminate their contract in that accommodation. So at the point of the pandemic, where many people were frightened and maybe wanted to travel back and be with loved ones or family or get to a kind of safe location, students living in purpose-built student accommodation didn't have that didn't have the ability to terminate that contract and give notice to leave. They were effectively tied into accommodation contracts which would run more or less slightly concurrent with the academic year. So in the kind of springtime they would be tied into a contract until say July or August or September they would often be tied into. And so that was one of the initial challenging points where people had that financial burden, students faced that financial burden of having to pay rent on accommodation that they were no longer living in. But thankfully, due to the concerns raised by students, initially some accommodation providers, often the university owned accommodation, provided the ability for students to leave and essentially waived that contract. And then the Scottish Government, through support with Ross Greer, MSP, introduced a right through the temporary coronavirus legislation for students to give notice. Regarding the wider financial impacts of the pandemic, these were incredibly stark. And I think often if we think about students in a kind of education context, but as we kind of paint the picture of some students being in a corridor or maybe a childhood bedroom, trying to access their courses, at the same time they had lost out on the employment opportunities that they would typically have. You know, be that working in cinemas or hospitality or retail or all the parts of the economy where students really rely on for additional income. Because as Mr McCabe said, the reality is that students, the student support loan system, grant system in Scotland does not actually cover the ability for students to survive and to live. You have to supplement that with additional part-time and sometimes even full-time work in addition to your studies. And therefore students faced a remarkably challenging financial situation whilst also facing the kind of health context of the coronavirus spreading and the fear that came through that, the isolation of lockdown, and then on top of that, trying to complete your studies because, you know, there's a career or a life path that you want for yourself. So they're under enormous pressure. And often in our engagements with students, they were focused less actually sometimes on their academic challenges and were focused more on the financial pressures that they were facing, because quite simply they couldn't afford to pay their rent or kind of keep their home warm. So from an NUS Scotland perspective, we helped raise the voice of students through the pandemic, through drawing awareness of Scottish ministers to the challenges that students were facing, to conducting research and putting that research out into the public domain so that the society was aware of the financial pressures that students were facing, and there was some additional monies provided to students through discretionary hardship funding pots that were allocated to their university or college to then distribute out to students.
Yeah, if I may come in on that point in particular, so with regards to the hardship and discretionary funds, this was something that I know a lot of students in particular during COVID were able to benefit from, and actually some of the rules around those hardship funds were changed, which meant that some international students who wouldn't ordinarily be able to access discretionary and hardship funds were able to do so during the pandemic. However, one of the real challenges with hardship and discretionary funds is that, as Matt said, it would be up to the university or college in terms of distributing those, and there would still be a process in which that student would have to apply for those funds, and that presents a real barrier to a number of students who may be in absolute sort of destitution, but still wouldn't apply for a hardship fund for a variety of different reasons. A number of reasons cited by some students, and this is primarily anecdotal, but a number of students would say, well, there's going to be someone who needs it more than me, so it'd be publicised, how much money is going into that fund, and so it's a fixed pot, and so students who actually are really, really suffering would think, I'm not going to apply for that because someone else needs it more. Also, just the process of applying could be particularly difficult for a number of students. So, as I say, the process varied from institution to institution. So it wasn't a sort of joined up application form, but often they would require things like bank statements, proof of your income, things like that, that actually some students might simply just not want to give their university or college their full bank statements to show them everything that they've been spending. Other students might not be able to access that. So with banks being closed, if a student, for example, actually isn't able to access a laptop or Wi-Fi because they don't have enough money, then the process for them to be able to get that money would require them to have a laptop or other device to be able to apply for the fund and gather all the evidence that they would require for that, which could also be quite a time-consuming process when they're also perhaps working significant hours alongside their studies. So you see the real sort of combination of impacts that meant that while those hardship and discretionary funds were very, very welcome, actually they didn't manage to reach all the students who needed them. With regards to the students, the impact in terms of employment, as both Matt and Liam have said, primarily students will be working in retail, hospitality, and those were two sectors which were particularly affected. But actually, in terms of the way that students engage with those sectors as well, might be somewhat different to the general population. So, for example, a high prevalence of 0 hours contracts, which would mean that things like furlough payments might actually not quite reach them in the same way as they would other members of the population. And the nature of the way in which students would typically might be having more hours during the summer versus fewer hours during term time. Well, when the pandemic hit in March, chances are they hadn't been working, certainly not as many hours as they might have been in the summer, and so that would mean that any furlough payments that they might get would actually be based off of how much they've been working during that period rather than during the summer. So that then, come the summer, there wouldn't be opportunities for students who would be perhaps unemployed the rest of the year and then would get a job in the summer, but also those students who might just have a job year round but vary their hours, their payments wouldn't go up in the summer from furlough because it would still be based off of the hours that they were working beforehand. So that would be a particular challenge for students, particularly in the hospitality sector. In the retail sector, again, it might well be the same in terms of some aspects of the retail sector. In some other aspects of the retail sector, things like supermarkets, for example, actually a number of students, because perhaps older members of staff within those supermarkets and other retail shops might be then sort of self-isolating, taking themselves out. Actually, a number of students ended up taking on more hours during the pandemic working in that space, and as Matt said, that could then have a detrimental impact in terms of their studies, to students often taking additional shifts just so that they can keep the rent paid rather than attending class, for example. So there were some particular detrimental impacts in terms of finance and accommodation there. And just in terms of accommodation, the other thing that I'll just mention very briefly is when you consider the way that student halls and purpose-built student accommodation, for example, are designed. I think a lot of us, and I'm sure sort of everyone across the country and around the world can relate to the isolation that you feel and that we all felt during lockdown. But when you consider then that actually student accommodation is often designed, the rooms are very, very small. Often, it's a shared kitchen between 8 or more people. Perhaps that actually they would be told that you can't all be in the kitchen at the same time, for example. And that's a really quite horrible place to be isolating in. And again, that impact that has on isolation, loneliness, mental well-being, and then the impact that isolation, loneliness and mental well-being then have on things like your ability to succeed academically. Again, you can see just how it's sort of a domino effect of really, really affecting a number of students.
Thank you.
I suppose in relation to some of what's been spoken about already, as Mr. Kelly made mention of, in terms of the purpose-built private student accommodation, and trying, to get students out of those contracts as quickly as we possibly could with partners in Parliament. These are not inexpensive facilities. And so what we found was that, yes, while we did manage in the second piece of emergency COVID legislation, the specific name for which, of course, is in my statement, they managed to get that in. That was, a couple of months down the line by that point. And because of how expensive these facilities often can be for student accommodation, they're talking comparable to rent in the private sector, if not usually higher. And so by the time that we were able to get some of those students out of those contracts, they'd already several £100s out of pocket for accommodation that they did not use, if not perhaps in some cases the more expensive end, in excess of £1,000 easily and upwards. And so that will naturally have an impact on students and their finances under those circumstances as well. And I think in particular what I wanted to touch on was, just off the back of what had already been said, was in regards to the distribution mechanism for the support that the government was bringing to the fore. One of the main things that I negotiated with government in at the beginning of the pandemic was for additional monies to be brought forward. Again, the precise breakdown of which is available in my statement, but it roughly came to about £21 million worth of some of it expedited, some of it new, most of it expedited, like a small amount of it new. But what we were saying to the government at that time was we would prefer to see, in a lot of those cases, an extension of bursary provision as it existed under current parameters into the summer months, rather than utilising the distribution mechanism of hardship and discretionary funds, largely for the reasons that Ms Gomersall laid out in great detail. Whether it was a level of discomfort of revealing personal financial expenditure, a feeling that people might need it more, etc., etc. I understood ultimately that the government thought, well, there might be some difficulties and some legislative hurdles and some regulatory issues with, SAS and other public bodies like that in terms of extending these existing things, these existing bursary mechanisms beyond their natural life cycles, that would be difficult, and it might be more pragmatic. Sorry for touching the microphone there. It might be more pragmatic to use the distribution mechanisms which exist locally. But that did then potentially lead to a situation where it was disadvantaging particular kinds of students, putting certain kinds of students off. And again, certainly for the 4 months that I was in place, there was at that time, to the best of my recollection, no provision for the possibility that international students could access those funds. I think there was scarcely a hardship or a discretionary fund available in any institution, college or university, where international students had any kind of access to that funding. And that's something which came much later down the line. And so we did raise objections and concerns about a lot of this thing. And don't get me wrong, the government were, understanding of, and they did hear those concerns. And of course, they did take what I think ultimately was a pragmatic approach to just getting money out as quick as they possibly could under difficult circumstances. But not to, kind of allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. But there were certain occasions, certainly even just in those first 4 months, where you were engaging earnestly and in good faith with the government, and 99% of the time you felt you were getting the exact same back, but it just felt that certain things were being heard but not heeded, I think ultimately that arises from the reality of the pandemic. There was scarcely a government anywhere in the West, at least, who had adequate plans in place to respond to this across any kind of sector, never mind further in higher education, which is incredibly complicated. But it did mean that we were throwing a lot of things at the wall and seeing what stuck, and then, just try to make up, fill in the gaps wherever we could thereafter. And that's something I think that we hopefully take from this inquiry going forward, about how we actually build in ways of responding more quickly to these kinds of shocks. Because ultimately, as I'm sure we'll touch on perhaps later on, the further and higher education sectors in Scotland prior to COVID, and if COVID had not even happened, are incredibly vulnerable to any kind of international economic shock because of the increasing reliability, especially in the university sector, on international student fees, to kind of make the whole system work. And the fragility that's been built in as a result of low public investment means that, whether it's a pandemic or something else, there will be needs to respond to these kinds of shocks in future if we're not careful. And if we're not careful, they will manifest similar problems.
Thank you very much, all. I think if we could then turn on to discuss academic impacts, and in particular the impacts on learning and assessment, but included in that you've already touched on practical subjects, so whichever the key impacts were in relation to academic impacts, if we can spend some time on that now, and we can perhaps start with Mr. McCabe and work our way down the line.
Sure. So, as I alluded to earlier, one of the main issues that arose in those 4 months, or the immediate questions that needed to be answered, was how are we going to calculate what students' final grades are, and what are, or at the very least, if not the final grade for their qualifications, what their final grade is going to be for the year, and what that will then augur for their final grades down the line. As you can imagine, students were greatly exercised, to put it diplomatically, about this on campuses, after having put in, after doing an undergraduate degree, 4 years of really, really hard graft, you know, like pouring themselves into their studies, only to potentially find that because of COVID and not being able to access this, not being able to do that, not being able to do this particular part of the course in the way that it was initially intended, that they might find themselves with a lesser degree and therefore have, you know, potentially longer term, less employability as a result of that. Because of all those concerns, you know, that was front of mind for students and among the membership, and so I did work quite hard with government and with stakeholders in other parts of the education sector to try and, you know, find some way of resolving this. Now, for the most part, to the best of my recollection, colleges, I think, were very, very quick and, you know, and were very quick to and very open about the fact that they were going to pursue something called no detriment, a policy of no detriment, or no detriment policies. Essentially does what it says on the tin, the idea being that we recognise that COVID was unforeseen, we recognise it's inhibited people's learning, irrespective of your course, to varying degrees, and therefore we are going to do whatever we can using various different mechanisms to try and get in place a way of calculating your final grade, which is going to be reflective of your ability and not reflective instead of the unforeseen circumstances that were thrust upon you. And several universities similarly were good at this too. There were a lot of really good and really generous no detriment policies out there. You know, some universities, for example, were saying, you know, the way that we will accommodate for this is we will take your worst module, so that if you completely crashed out of a module because of COVID, we will just, like, you know, take that off your average completely and calculate it based on this. And, you know, as you can imagine, there were various different universities had various different approaches. Sometimes they had several approaches, and they would use the one that best worked for that student to get them the best final grade they possibly could. And all of that was really admirable. But what was disappointing was the inability of the sector to cohere around a unified position on policies of no detriment. This was a particular issue with universities, and some of the more elite universities, or Russell Group universities in particular. Generally speaking, they all had good no detriment policies. In fact, they had some of the more generous no detriment policies. But when we were going to government and saying, you know, I think reasonably, to make sure that we could quell the concerns of students, ease their minds, give a guarantee to students across all of Scotland, don't worry, we recognise this, and all colleges, all universities are going to bend themselves entirely towards making sure that you get the best grade possible. And just to give everyone the reassurance of that guarantee, there was not necessarily an agreement on how to do that. I think colleges in particular, there was no concerns there. Many universities were quite all right calling the policies no detriment policies. But some universities, I think, out of a fear of being perceived to be soft touch, perhaps, are undermining a perception of academic rigour, which I think should not necessarily have been the priority at that time, given the unforeseen circumstances. Even if they had an incredibly decent no detriment policy, refused to call it a no detriment policy, and would not then, through you know, their representative bodies at the national level, commit to a unified statement or position, colleges, universities, government, national union students, on no detriment. And that was vexing. That was really vexing, because ultimately what we didn't want is for students to feel like it was going to become a postcode lottery, where depending on which college or which university you were at, you might or you might not get, you know, a good no detriment policy, or you might not get, you know, the kind of support to get the best grade you possibly could under the circumstances. And that's probably one of the examples where, again, I felt like, you know, I was very clear to the best of my recollection, with government, with senior civil servants who I spoke to on a bi-weekly basis, the minister who I spoke with on a bi-weekly basis, that this is something that would go a really long way to providing peace of mind to students when peace of mind was not easy to find under the circumstances. And I almost felt like there was a calculation made that this was a battle that they weren't willing to pick with this particular group of stakeholders, and we're just going to let universities and colleges go off and do their own thing and say their own thing to students. And that did cause concern, you know, because one of the things that, as it's been touched on earlier, one of the first things I did in the first couple of weeks of the pandemic was start the all-officer meeting that met weekly, so we were getting up-to-date weekly, weekly touching base with officers all across the country at all levels, affiliated unions and non-affiliated unions, about what was going on. That was coming from almost every direction. Concerns about attainment, concerns about access to, you know, about assessment, about final grades, about how things were going to be marked, if exams were going to go ahead, whatever it would be. And I just felt there was a little bit of a failure in that respect on the part of the government to kind of, you know, say, no, we, like, you know, and kind of, you know, put his foot down and say, we need to come by a unified statement on this. I think in the end, ultimately, because all the colleges and unis were trying to do something, and they all mostly did get to that place eventually on their own, the real impact of that was not as severe as it otherwise could have been, but ultimately it caused unnecessary dismay because there was a lack of willingness to challenge some stakeholders to kind of come to the table and find agreement, which, like I said, was vexing.
Thank you. Mr. Pretty.
Yeah, so I suppose I arrived in the post in July 2020, formally having been elected in the spring of 2020, just before the first lockdown, and having been at the University of Strathclyde Student Union. And as Mr McCabe's touched on, at the outset, students were just totally confused as to what was happening. They were like, "What? I've done 90% of my course. I'm now being put into we're going into a lockdown. I'm scared about our health and well-being, and I've got to think about this exam, which is now no longer taking place in person. It's been moved online, but I don't have access to the library to do it. So what is happening to my grades?" And that was really the kind of initial concern. And as Mr McCabe's given a kind of broad overview of the idea of no detriment, so that for students who had clearly demonstrated against the learning outcomes in their course and had done their course for 90% of their course prior to the pandemic, they had demonstrated their learning outcomes, and therefore you could pursue things like a no detriment policy. It got slightly more challenging with courses that were reliant on accreditation bodies, external accreditation bodies. So if a course was handled more locally at the college or university with a teacher who was in front of their class and knew what their students were facing on the kind of at the coalface, there was a bit more flexibility there, and there was a greater ability to give students a degree of certainty. Where courses were relying on external accreditation bodies, that certainty often didn't come, or if it came really, really late, because there was a much broader kind of background bureaucratic process that had to take place for general agreement on how to proceed. I suppose my experience started formally in NUS Scotland July 2020 and then moved on. It got more difficult as the pandemic went on to offer students reassurance in these ways. So things like you could give a degree of reassurance for those final year students in the spring of 2020, as an example. That got a lot harder later on when we were talking about another year of restrictions, and where students were maybe in their second and their third year, or just halfway through their college course. It became more difficult to kind of track, and that's where I suppose particularly those students that were on the more practical courses, it was tough. You know, I would take calls with students who were scratching their head about what it is they were supposed to do. So they were putting in a tremendous amount of work to complete their assessments that were given to them, their coursework, and they were doing it under the most incredible circumstances, much more difficult circumstances actually than kind of pre-pandemic, because they were dealing with all the wider context of COVID. But they felt like, you know, I'm at college, will the university accept my qualification? Will employers think my qualification's valid? And then you also heard from people who felt frustrated at not getting access to the kind of practical teaching, and maybe didn't feel like they had that degree of confidence actually too, because okay, they'd done a lot of the online study but hadn't had access to the kind of practical experience, and therefore did feel that lack of confidence in kind of progressing forward. And there was a lot of work done there. I think throughout the pandemic, NUS Scotland, we were really, really cautious about ensuring the safety of students and the safety of our communities, and ensuring that, you know, the kind of well-being and the promoting of the public health messaging. And I think where we were kind of discussing, and I'm sure we'll come on to it on the return to campus, was that there was often needing a degree of priority for those students where the courses were more or less entirely practical, or a lot of the learning took place in a practical basis. There were challenges around how assessment would be delivered. So again, you found that again, sometimes related to whether or not a course had an external accreditation body, where through different points, even when we were under different coronavirus restrictions, there was maybe a move to have an exam in person, because that's how it had always taken place. So you had to get people back in person to sit down at a table so that they could be monitored and etc. So there was a degree sometimes of kind of falling back on, that's how it's always been done, so we need to get back to that as quickly as possible. Even though the pandemic, even though the virus was still spreading and students were still a little bit anxious about going back in person, we often heard concerns about that, where people were worried about the virus, but you know, their assessment had been scheduled to take place in person, and they felt anxious about that as well.
I'll try and keep it super brief and not repeat anything that's already been said. I think the key things that I think are important to focus on in terms of many of the impacts around assessment in particular, going back to that idea that many students were impacted by the pandemic quite differently. And in some ways, if everyone had all been affected a lot, but at least everyone was affected the same amount, that would perhaps make things a little bit easier, because then you can sort of adjust accordingly. But because different people are affected in different ways, I think that makes it really, really challenging. And it meant that no detriment policies had to be able to be sort of adaptable for for different students' circumstances. I think one of the issues around the PSRB's professional statutory regulatory bodies meant that you might have most students in one particular university, for example, who actually the university has taken one particular approach to assessments. So, for example, moving away from timed exams, moving more towards a sort of coursework model, which actually a lot of universities were moving more towards pre-pandemic anyway. But then you might have one PSRB, one regulatory body that says, no, you have to have an exam in order to have your degree accredited by this body. And therefore the university would then have to put that provision in place, and the no detriment of policy might then affect those different students differently. And you might even, in some circumstances, you might have multiple courses within, similar courses within an institution that share modules where one of those qualifications is accredited by a PSRB and another isn't, but because they share modules, they all have to be examined in the same way. So someone whose qualification wouldn't even be accredited by the PSRB would still have to have the stricter exam regulation under the PSRB rules for the qualification that it shares a module with. So you can see how actually it just meant that there was a lot of uncertainty, and it meant that any sort of policies, any adaptations that were being designed by an individual university, which could well be a postcode lottery, had to be really able to adapt for the different circumstances of the different students. And I don't think it would have been possible to have come up with necessarily a policy that would have succeeded at that in every single regard. Some of the requirements by PSRBs in some universities in terms of the way that they did assessments, for example, many, as I say, moved just towards coursework. Some moved more towards saying, okay, here's the exam paper, you've got a week to complete it. Some would say, here's the exam paper, you've got 2 hours to complete it, as it would be if it was a more formal in-person exam, except you're at home. And if you're a student who's got a desk and got access to a computer and all of that, then great. But if you're a student who has got caring responsibilities, the kids might be knocking on the door. You might just not have somewhere that you can actually sit and do that exam. It just widens that gap, and it means that those students, particularly working class students, students from most disadvantaged backgrounds, would be impacted disproportionately by that. And as I say, just then finding a way to make sure that those students get the grade that they then deserve, incredibly challenging.
Thank you very much. And do you have any comments on lessons, good or bad, and any changes that have been made in relation to learning? And
I think it's interesting at the moment, in particular, actually, even just thinking sort of post-pandemic, because as I say, before the pandemic, actually, a lot of institutions were exploring, okay, how they can adapt their academic provision, how they can adapt things like assessments. That we are, I think, starting to have a culture shift even beyond tertiary education in Scotland, having that conversation about moving away from formal examinations, for example. And so some institutions might have been having that conversation sort of beforehand, and I think many of them will have been better prepared for then having to adapt very quickly for the pandemic. There's another interesting thing, I think, in terms of the difference between the way that assessments were done in 2020 versus 2021, because the first lockdown happened at the end of March in 2020, and so if you think about it, most institutions would then be having exams in that sort of April-May period, so very, very quick after lockdown. So having to adapt very, very fast, and sort of often just come up with, okay, what is a solution that we can put in place quickly. Whereas in 2021, it was much more thought through, but actually in some ways that disadvantaged some other students, because in 2020 it was much more likely to be that sort of approach of, okay, we're going to find, here's the assessment, you've got a week or so to complete it. It was much more sort of lenient, I think, in some ways at many institutions. I'm generalising here because it did vary from place to place. Whereas in 2021, I think you had much more of a situation where, because then the universities were then sort of trying to fit more that mould of how perhaps they used to do things before, or try to appease things like the professional and regulatory bodies, or thinking about how, as Liam said, that sort of idea of making sure that their degrees were still competitive. They didn't want people to think that a qualification from their university that had been got in those years would be worth less than the same qualification in another year, or the same qualification from a different institution. So that I think had a lot of challenges. I think one of the key lessons to be learnt is that I think that there's a lot of data that does show that formal examinations aren't necessarily the best way of measuring a student's success, that they do disproportionately impact, for example, working class students. And actually those institutions who are maybe going down that different approach even post-pandemic, I think actually if we've got a model that that is more based on things like coursework, for example, or other forms of assessment, then if another pandemic or another sort of major emergency hits, then actually you won't need these big adaptations, because actually we've got a model that works better regardless of the mode of study. So I think that's one of the key lessons actually is that we need to be adapting the way we do things even out with pandemic times, so that when pandemics and other events do hit, we don't have to change as much.
Thank you very much. I think if we could then move on, and starting with you, Ms. Gomesall, again, to mental health and well-being and social impacts. So roll them up together, and obviously it's wider than just the mental health and well-being. So things like, I think you touched on the confidence aspect, etc. So if you could please start, and we'll work our way back up.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I think I've covered some of this already, so I'll try not to repeat any of that, just around some of the issues around sort of increased loneliness, isolation, the way that student accommodation is designed, being unable to see people. I think it's important to recognise that I would certainly consider that we've had a student mental health crisis for a very long time, including pre-pandemic. And when you look at the statistics of students who are experiencing, severe symptoms of depression, suicidality, suicidal ideation, things like that, this was a really big issue pre-pandemic too. And so then when you add in the combination of the loneliness and isolation that comes as a result of the pandemic, that exacerbates an already severe problem. And one of the good things that the Scottish Government did, again, this was pre-pandemic, but I think it had a really positive impact throughout the pandemic, was the provision of mental health counsellors throughout Scottish universities and colleges. So those were funded by the Scottish Government. That was a 5-year scheme that I believe first started in, I think, 2019. And that came to an end just this academic year, in fact. But actually students being able, rather than, we know the pressures that the NHS were facing, particularly during the pandemic, access to mental health services, in particular really long waiting lists. And actually a lot of students were able to access a mental health counsellor on campus. When I say on campus, that might, more likely to have been a virtual, appointment, but within the university or college throughout that time, which has a positive impact. And of course there would still be waiting lists, but that would that's still probably shorter than with the NHS more broadly. That as I say, so that funding has come to an end now. So if there were to be another pandemic, then there might be a more urgent response that would be required there in terms of dealing with those particular exacerbations. But actually, I think that one of the key things the Scottish Government needs to be doing is looking at the different root causes of student mental health issues more broadly, so that when we have things like pandemics hit, the exacerbations are perhaps not quite as severe. And in particular, when you look at the root causes, so the Thriving Learners Survey, for example, which I think you've received as part of our evidence, that shows very clearly a link between things like food insecurity and poor mental health among students, particularly around student poverty and the link between student poverty and poor mental health. And as we spoke about earlier on, those things, particularly around poverty, and obviously poverty then has an impact on food security, massively exacerbated by the pandemic too. So not only did you have student mental health worsened by things like the loneliness and isolation, those more sort of direct impacts, but then also those secondary impacts, because the pandemic impacted people's finances, and their financial situation then impacted their mental health. So yeah, I mean, I think some of the wider issues in terms of the social impacts, I mean, and actually this ties into the academic impacts as well, because I think a huge amount of the learning that comes from being at college or university, it's not necessarily what someone is standing up in front of you in a classroom and teaching you. It's all the things that happen out with the classroom, but also those sort of side conversations that you might have within a lecture, having a wee break and then chatting about the material with someone sat next to you to learn and understand more about sort of their perspective on what you've just been taught. All of that disappears during online and remote learning, where you're not able to have those sort of side conversations, those more informal, more casual chats with people. That has a real impact, I think, just in terms of your academic ability, as well as, of course, the social impacts of that. University, particularly if you are a school leaver, often it's the first time that you've lived away from home, for example, and building up and developing all of those really crucial social skills that are going to really help you throughout life. And we've got a whole generation of students who actually never really got that, and I really worry about the impact there. And then also, I think the other impact that I think is slightly out with sort of, I suppose, direct remit within NUS during the pandemic, but actually that we're now seeing the impact of, is students who were at school during the pandemic and had their school years incredibly disrupted, and now are sort of flying the nest, going to college or university for the first time, but maybe not having had learned some of those social skills that they might have learnt at school otherwise. So you can see how sort of the social element of it, I think, is going to have a real knock-on effect actually for years to come, beyond just the pandemic period itself.
Thank you. Mr. Creaney.
Thank you. Yeah, Miss Gomez, I think has covered a lot of the impacts to a large degree. As kind of touched on, it really exacerbated some of the challenges that already existed around student mental health. I did see through my time as NUS Scotland President, those, again, kind of publicly funded counselling and mental wellbeing facilities for students. Again, a lot of them did pivot to online delivery as well, which was a a positive development. You know, when the lockdowns occurred. Just regards to mental wellbeing support, and I know we'll come to the return to campus, but there were particular challenges for those students that were in student accommodation. So where there were coronavirus outbreaks within student accommodation and whole accommodation blocks were locked down, you had at that point a lot of the students who were in those accommodation blocks had newly arrived. They were potentially in a new city or a new country for the first time where they didn't know anyone, and they were, due to the kind of spread of the virus within those environments, and I know we'll touch on that, they were isolated into a small accommodation room and didn't have access to much welfare support. Really, the welfare support was difficult to come by, and the circumstances were just incredibly difficult for those students. It was a really challenging time, and I suppose that relates to the wider isolation that will be felt across society really through the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns. It's not necessarily just specific to students around, you know, being isolated, but as Miss Gomersall touched on, the data kind of bears out just how challenging the mental health and well-being landscape was for students at the outset of the pandemic, and just how more difficult that got. When employment opportunities dried up and added additional pressures, when there was uncertainties around whether or not you could secure housing or what your housing situation would look like, on top of, you know, am I going to get my course? Am I getting my grades? Am I qualifying? What's happening to my life? Am I going to have to drop out and come back and redo this part of my life? As well as those wider social developmental opportunities that often come with being at college or university too.
Thank you. Mr. McCabe.
Yeah, just further to what has already been said, I think wherever you looked, irrespective of the circumstances, there were impacts upon some students' mental health. Most students, I think, in the ideal scenario, you know, if a student did, you know, kind of get a sense that things were going to get quite tightly restricted quite quickly, you know, and they had a functional family home to go to with space, then their mental health may actually have fared better than most. But that's an ideal type. That wasn't the case for a lot of people. As has been remarked, some people were going back to busy houses, busy homes, if they had one to go to, not a lot of space, not only people joining lectures from phones and stairwells, are in the stairs of their own home. I heard horror stories, you know, again, from those all-officers meetings of students trying to write dissertations on their mobile phones, you know, and anyone who's tried to do any kind of document longer than one side of A4 on Microsoft Word app, you know how impossible it would be to construct a document of that type, especially if you try to do any form of citation. So it just, you know, and that ties back into the kind of, again, the total lack of readiness when it came to digital provision that I spoke to earlier. And all these things have a knock-on impact, as has already been touched on, you know, like the kind of difficulty in accessing the right kind of stuff to get your academic work completed to a standard that you're happy with, all leads to mounting worry, which then has an impact on that mental health. But that then coupled with, you know, the reality that that ideal type I spoke to wasn't the case for many people. A lot of people didn't have functional family homes to go back to, or could not go back to them if they had them. Shortly after I finished at NUS Scotland, I went to work for a now no longer operational charity called Standalone, which represented or advocated for the interests of estranged students, and often underappreciated and underrepresented group within the cohort of Scottish education, who experienced, just to put it in very, you know, straightforward terms to keep things relatively brief, much of the same social and economic challenges of care experienced students, but with none of the kind of the corporate parenting, the bursaries or anything like it, because their circumstances can be more complex, more difficult to kind of understand and characterise. and they miss out on the kind of statutory support, which it makes them easier to identify for additional support from institutions like colleges and universities. You know, whether it was care experience students, strange students, international students who just simply could not get back to wherever they had come from, they found themselves, as Mr. Crilly noted, you know, in an accommodation where they might not have anyone available to them, who were family, sometimes not even friends, because they hadn't had the opportunity in some cases to make them because of the pandemic, confidants, and all the stuff that, you know, you often require, the support network which is necessary to get you through, you know, your time in further higher education, because it is a rigorous process, it is challenging, it is difficult, and it is that social element and the support network that comes from the social element oftentimes that makes it doable, that makes it realisable, that makes it possible for students to actually get their academic work over the line, because they have this ballast that keeps them grounded, keeps them centred, and provides them with that outlet. And being isolated in accommodation made it incredibly difficult to do that. Now, credit to a lot of colleges and universities, they did have, you know, on their accommodation teams and things like that, you know, back office staff in and around those kinds of facilities were working really hard to kind of make sure that, you know, they were dropping things off at people's doors, socially distancing where they could, checking in on people who they knew had vulnerabilities and, you know, in particular needs. You know, I know that students became very active in certain places. And one example that jumps to mind is at the University of Glasgow, one of the non-affiliates that we work closely with, the SRUC. They coordinated, you know, with student volunteers safely, social distance, of course, doing medicine drops, food delivery drops around all their student halls of accommodation, supported by the university as well, I believe, to kind of, you know, provide, you know, just those outlets and just touching base with people, which did have a positive impact. But again, the extent to which that was, you know, remedying anything, it just simply wasn't. It was, you know, it was mitigating, but it could never remedy. One final thing I'd want to touch on when it comes to the mental health and well-being side of things is all of this mounting pressure leading to knock-on impacts on mental health, isolation, loneliness, etc. The support mechanisms that Ms. Gomershaw touched on in terms of, you know, the counselling provision and things of that nature as well. In many cases, and a lot of times, whether they were, you know, the additional places which were funded by the government, which was agreed during my tenure as president and started during that period and rolled across both of my successors here, or the university or college's own counselling provision, which they had in place beforehand, a lot of the times that would be provided person to person, sometimes online, sometimes not, and moving from delivering you know, something which is therapeutic, like, you know, like you know, a therapeutic provision for mental health and well-being, how you change the setting of that can have a major impact on how people experience it and what people get out of it. And for some people that would have been detrimental, deleterious perhaps even, to their ability to engage with that and to get as much out of it as they needed to improve their mental health. And not only that, the demand on these services increased well beyond the point of feasibility as a result of what was going on during the pandemic as well. And so I suppose that just kind of brings me kind of back to something which I've touched on briefly here and there, which is the fragility that we see in further and higher education. It's not just about the fragility of the economic well-being of our institutions due to over-reliance on you know, international markets and international recruitment markets. It's the fragility that's built into the support structure and infrastructure which exists for students because of the lack of meaningful public investment for a very long time in colleges and universities. And that then meant that in the context of health and well-being, when students needed support for that the most during an unforeseen pandemic, it simply A, was not there, and B, there was not the resource to create it.
Thank you. Well, if we can move on then to the penultimate topic, and it's the return to campus in September 2020. And Mr. Crilly, you were there leading the charge, so if you'd like to lead the charge now as well.
Yeah, so I think this is the most challenging time that I experienced, certainly as president of NUS Scotland. I suppose I took on the role formally in July 2020, and again, very quickly the conversation was what happens in September of 2020, in August of 2020. So we'd moved from kind of immediate pandemic response, you know, things moving very quickly online and getting things over the line, to what happens next a little bit. And my recollection is that during that summer, a lot of the conversations were still relatively cautious about the return to campus, but that, and I know that the inquiry, I'm sure, will be looking at some of the decisions that were taken, but certainly the final guidance, Scottish Government guidance that went out to the sector, I think didn't include some of the cautious language in the earlier drafts of the guidance, which would have advised against large-scale large lectures, for example, for students gathering. So the Scottish Government guidance that went out to the college and university sector opened the door essentially for more in-person provision and in-person learning and teaching for that return to campus. During that period in particular, students were really looking for certainty as to what was happening with their education. And at that point, we're still fairly cautious about returning to normal, so to speak. So, you know, we were still relatively new through a pandemic. There was a high degree of anxiety around potentially large-scale gatherings and people's worry about the kind of safety of that. And that was very much the what we were seeking to convey during this period. But we were probably taken aback somewhat in September 2020. I think through this time, the university and colleges were on an institutional basis at a senior level were keen to have as much of an in-person teaching offer to students as possible. And at that time, as has been touched on through our session so far, the highest single source of income for many of our universities comes from international and postgraduate taught private tuition fees. And my understanding at that time through engagements that I was involved in is that there was a fear that if learning was to be delivered, learning and teaching was to be delivered exclusively online or predominantly online, that if that was the offer presented to students, many international students might not want to come and enrol on a £20,000 a year fee-paying course at a university in Scotland. They might choose to maybe study locally or to choose an alternative path. So there was a fear that if universities in particular weren't able to say to students that their teaching would be in person, that many students would not seek to enrol or on courses, on fee-paying courses in that period. So we saw on the return to campus, we saw very large-scale outbreaks as students returned in high numbers to student accommodation because they were told that they were to receive in-person blended learnings, but they would have to essentially be close to the university because they would have to access the in-person teaching provision that was being kind of delivered. So students had to be close to the university, which meant they arrived in large numbers to the student accommodation, which, as colleagues have touched on, is often 8 people to a flat. And so there was a big movement of students into accommodation, densely populated accommodation, and we saw the virus spread. And there were, in September of 2020, October of 2020, there were large-scale coronavirus outbreaks in student accommodation across Scotland. It was an incredibly challenging time to make sure that those students received the support that they required. And as I touched on, many of these students were, coming in through a new environment, moving away for the first time, and without having social support networks in place. And so we saw students in several cases go without access to food because there was an outbreak in accommodation, an entire accommodation block of hundreds and hundreds of students would be shut down, and there was a scramble to try and make sure that those students had access to food, they had access to the necessities that they needed to live, and it was really, really difficult. And through this time, we heard of the concerns of students who were struggling with that. We're also struggling, because they were contracting the virus. There was no vaccinations at this point. People were contracting the virus and were really worried about their health and the spreading of the virus. At this point too, we had students that were in incredible distress, and we spoke and worked with the Scottish Government to ensure that the guidance was flexible enough that if students were in a severe level of distress that they could leave the accommodation too. But those outbreaks in accommodation were really quite incredible. And if we talk about the impacts as well, there was a breakdown of trust, I think, from students at that point, and those that held the positions of authority, because they'd been told to return to campus because they had to access in-person teaching. They then returned. There was big outbreaks. The learning and teaching then went online anyway. So they'd arrived at campus. They'd paid their fees. They'd paid their rent. They were then learning online anyway. And then the rubber hit the road when that was the case, where owing to the outbreaks that occurred in campus, University Scotland issued a request that all students essentially stay at home. So it placed students in Scotland in a semi-official national lockdown that came from a voice of authority within the country. Again, there was just a mass degree of confusion among students, because this semi-official lockdown was announced, and many students were like, well, I'm not living in student accommodation. I'm a mature student that lives at home with my family. I'm a postgraduate. I'm a college student. I'm a college student. Does this statement that's been issued by University of Scotland, does this apply to me? I'm not enrolled at a university, so does this student lockdown apply to me? What does it mean by way of my employment? So there's a semi-official lockdown for students being announced. Do I still have to attend my work? Do I still have to attend my job? If I don't, what are the ramifications for that? So because this announcement was not a formal government announcement, it created these really intense implications for students. And as I say, it damaged the relationship and the trust between students and their institutions, and also government too. It made it really, really challenging. And students at that point too felt isolated from the rest of society, because they were essentially, they felt like they were being seen as the cause of the pandemic and the cause of the virus spreading, and they felt that they were being judged because of that, despite the fact that they were kind of told that they had to be there and they had to arrive on campus to take part in their education. So they felt like they were being unfairly blamed for the circumstances that had occurred. And so there was a degree of social impact between students and kind of wider communities, and the wider communities across Scotland. And that was a really challenging point, I think, to recover from through the pandemic, because it really impacted the relationships at that key time. The kind of trust from students through the process was damaged, and through the pandemic, we'd worked really, really closely and really well with the Scottish Government, with public health advisors, Public Health Scotland, wider bodies, to really further the guidance and the messaging, the public health messaging that was being shared. So we tried our utmost through that period to really share that messaging and really encourage a sense of social solidarity from students, to kind of look out for each other and look out for their wider communities and keep themselves safe and keep the wider community safe. And I think that process during the autumn of 2020 was incredibly difficult, and had really quite strong impacts on students.
Thank you, Mr. Crilly. We have 7 minutes left, and I'm conscious that we still need to hear about ongoing impacts and a sweep up on any disproportionate. So if it's all right with the rest of the panel, if I can turn to Ms. Gomersall to finish off the session, please.
Yeah, no problem at all. So, yeah, I mean, I think in terms of some of the longer term impacts, and some of these we've already mentioned, particularly with regards to some of the social impacts, I think there's some particular impacts with regards to, so we saw in the return to campus in 2022, we had a particular challenge with regards to housing and student accommodation, and actually also provision of other local services. Because one of the things that happened in 2020, following on from what Matt was just explaining there with that return to campus, is that actually that whole situation and sort of the prediction of that situation, many students chose not to go to university in 2020 when they might have otherwise chosen to do so, and to instead defer their studies to a later year, 2021 or 2022. And the Scottish Government and the Scottish Funding Council provided additional funded places for those later years up until this academic year now. But what that meant was that we had more students coming to university and college in 2022 in particular, and that put a particular strain on services such as accommodation, students finding it really, really difficult to find somewhere to live, in addition to the challenges that were happening during the pandemic and before the pandemic as well. And there's particularly high rates of homelessness among students as a result of accommodation challenges and the challenge of finding affordable and high quality accommodation for students to live in. So we found during 2 surveys that were done during the pandemic, we found that 12% of students across Scotland had experienced homelessness at some point during their studies, and that actually raised to 22% for international students as well. So international students were disproportionate. So more than 1 in 5 international students experiencing homelessness. Horror stories of international students arriving in the country, and one student who I know spent his first couple of weeks in Scotland sleeping in the bus station in Edinburgh, just down the road from here. Really, really horrifying to start off with. And then the additional pressures as a result of the additional students who had deferred their studies created this really sort of spiralling situation where we saw even higher rates, as I say, of homelessness and horror stories such as the one I just mentioned. So that was a particular impact too, and I think the provision of affordable, high-quality accommodation in Scotland for students has been a long-running issue, but as I say, the pandemic exacerbated that, and as we were sort of coming out of the tail end of it there. So that was particularly impactful. In terms of some of the disproportionate impacts that I just wanted to touch on as well, and this relates to the return to campus as well, and what Matt was explaining in terms of students being stuck inside sort of student accommodation rooms, and food being provided for them, for instance, by the facilities. There were a number of students who reported that their dietary requirements weren't being met. So students with allergens, but also Jewish and Muslim students not receiving kosher and halal meals. That was a particular disproportionate impact on that group of students then too. And in terms of some of the wider sort of disproportionate impacts, I think we've already covered some of the ways that, for instance, LGBT plus students were impacted, care experienced estranged students, disabled students, students with caring responsibilities, a real particular issue there. So students who, and in multiple regards, so for example, one of the big barriers to a lot of students who have caring responsibilities is finding childcare for their students whilst when they go to campus to study. And obviously that was mitigated during the pandemic, but of course with the schools being shut and then students also having to then study from home, having to do a course at university or college in the same room as well, you're also looking after young children. Really, really challenging for those students with caring responsibilities. And when you look at the reports that were produced by NUS Scotland during the pandemic years, it was care experienced students and students with caring responsibilities. Those were the two groups who consistently had the highest rates of student poverty as well. So you can see how those groups, it was really sort of just building upon building on other challenges. I think that there are, in terms of some of the longer term implications and in terms of some of, I think, the lessons learnt as well. I think when we look at some of the biggest challenges that students faced during the pandemic period itself, these are challenges actually that existed before the pandemic and still exist after the pandemic and were worsened during that period. So, for example, the issue around students not being able to end contracts in purpose-built student accommodation, that is something that now that emergency legislation that was put in place during the pandemic has ended, we're back in the same situation we were in before. That means that if another major incident were to hit, students would be in the exact same position as they were in back in 2020. And of course, it's not always just a pandemic that can be the sort of issue that a student might face. For example, if a student has experienced sexual assault by someone else living in the same flat as them, they don't have a right to move flat. They don't have a right to end that contract. That's horrifying. So some of these issues that if there were to be another pandemic, actually it feels like we've not really learnt any lessons, because these structural issues that are baked in to the sort of student experience right now, after the pandemic's over, we've just bounced straight back to how things were before, and students are still being disproportionately impacted. The challenges with regards to the funding model of universities in particular, and the real sort of reliance on international markets. We've seen just in the past year or so the impact, the knock-on effect that, for instance, a financial crash in another country in the world can have then on the rate of those students then coming and choosing to study in Scotland. And because the amount of money that the Scottish Funding Council and the Scottish Government provides to each university to fund a Scottish student's course isn't enough to actually cover the cost of that student, it means that, as we saw in particular during the pandemic, and was really exacerbated some of the issues, particularly with regards to the return to campus, decisions are being made based on the financial impact that they're going to have with regards to these international markets, rather than necessarily what was in the interests of students and the safety of the general population. So you see again how some of these longer term issues that existed before the pandemic and that we've just bounced straight back to afterwards, if another pandemic were to hit tomorrow, then actually we would be completely unprepared again, and we would literally just be repeating the exact same mistakes over and over. And I think that's a real shame, and something that the Scottish Government should be taking real cognizance of.
Well, thank you all so much for your time. It's been very enlightening. And my Lord, unless you have any further questions, I don't.
Thank you. Yes, thank you all very much. We'll take lunch now and come back at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.